10 p.m. according to my clock over here. Regrets that have been given are Trustee Hatfield and Student Trustee Unger. Trustee Sartori indicated that she will be a bit late, but that she'll be attending. And then I also don't see Trustee Cook here immediately, but I assume that she'll be attending as well. She didn't give regrets at this current moment. So I'll make note of her attendance once I see her join. With that, I would like to, can I get a mover for approval of the agenda?
So move.
Okay, moved by Trustee Halberstadt, and then I see Trustee Cheen in the chat as a seconder. I would like to make an amendment on behalf of administration and discussions today that we add item E1, which would be budget 2021-2022 presentation. It was I think maybe assumed that it would be presented at the time of the recommendation, but I think it would be more appropriate as a presentation up front in discussions today. So any further discussion or amendments to the agenda? Okay, I'm seeing none. Can I get all those in support as amended? Or should I say any opposed? Okay, seeing no opposition in the chat, I'll give it a second. Okay, and that carries. I will go now to item D, declaration of conflict of interest. Are there any declarations tonight? Seeing none, I will go on to presentations. So I will go to item E1, which would be our budget presentation. So I will turn it over to Superintendent Armstrong to do a presentation for the trustees.
Thank you very much, Trustee Sipcar. I would like to actually welcome Mr. Mayhew is with us this evening, as well as Ms. Malash to our meeting today. And I'd like to especially thank Mr. Mayhew and the entire finance team for their hard work, their diligence, and their commitment to completing the budget process with very compressed deadlines and with a degree of uncertainty that we have with respect to the expectations for the opening of school in September. I would also like to thank Mrs. Malash because she's done an awesome job in keeping everybody on track, keeping us organized, and for all of her work in organizing the budget packages that you have with you today. Thank you. Next slide. So our agenda for this evening is Mr. Mayhew and I are going to take you through an overview of the budget process and timelines, a funding overview, planning assumptions, risks and challenges to the budget, our funding, the board's funding allocation, how the budget reflects the strategic priorities of the board, operating expenses, COVID-19 expenditures, and some budget details. And then at the end, we would be happy to answer any questions. So the first item we wanted to review with you was the budget process and the timelines associated with that. So back in the beginning of March and throughout April, the board conducted a budget consultation process where we invited groups to come forward and to share their thinking with respect to the budget. And as well, the board conducted a survey as well for the 21-22 budget. On May the 4th, the GSN was released and the technical paper was provided by the Ministry of Education. On May the 18th, administration provided trustees with an update in terms of the GSN and the significant changes in the technical paper as a result. On June the 1st, administration also provided trustees with a high-level look of what the budget seemed to be trending towards. And then last week, we provided you with your draft budget package for your review and consideration. Tonight, we're here to present the draft 21-22 budget to you for consideration and approval. And next week, we are required to submit the budget and our EFA submission to the Ministry of Education. Next slide, please. In preparation for the 21-22 budget, the Greater Essex County District School Board invited parents, guardians, students, staff, and community members to provide input into the budget development process through a survey. The survey requested input to guide the budget development and to ensure alignment with the board's strategic priorities. A link to the board's strategic plan and the survey was shared via the board's website, social media, and through our schools in March of 2021, and it was open for an approximate 2-week period of time. A total of 825 individuals responded to the survey, including staff members, parents, community members, students, and other community partners. The survey asked respondents to rank the top 5 budget priorities based on a list of approximately 25 items, and there was also an opportunity to provide a write-in answer. The top 5 priorities from the survey respondents, which were consistent amongst the various respondent groups, is noted on this slide. Student mental health and well-being was consistently rated by all groups as the #1 budget priority. Next slide, please. At this time, I'd like to take you through an overview of the funding for the school board. So the board receives funding from primarily 3 main streams. The first one is the Ministry of Education, and this represents clearly our largest source of funding, primarily through the Grants for Student Needs funding, or what we'll refer to as the GSN throughout this presentation. Additionally, the board receives funding through the Priorities and Partnerships Fund, which we refer to as PPF, and then we receive capital funding that allows us to do infrastructure and capital projects for the board. The other funding that we receive is through other government ministries, including the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development, and the Ministry of Citizenship, Immigration and International Trade. These other ministry fundings support our employment services, language assessment, and literacy basic skills programs. And then we have a third source of funding, which is basically a miscellaneous or an other sources category. And this is funding that the board receives through international tuition, fundraising, interest income on our bank accounts, energy rebates, and other miscellaneous sources. As we indicated, the Grants for Student Need funding really is the largest source of funding that is available to the board from the Ministry of Education. From a provincial perspective, the GSN funding formula is designed to meet a variety of objectives, including fair allocation for students and amongst public, Catholic, French, and English language school boards, funding based on need, flexibility on the use of funding by individual boards, but there may be certain specific restrictions, including enveloping of certain funding allocations, such as in the area of special education, and also promoting school board accountability for the use of the funding. Now I'd like to take you through a summary of the planning assumptions that were used for purposes of developing this year's budget. From a planning perspective, our overarching priority is always to ensure that the budget aligns with the board's mission, vision, and strategic priorities. We consistently use conservative enrollment projections as well as part of the process. In addition, we also ensure and make assumptions about adherence to all the collective agreements and other contractual obligations of the board. The budget consistently makes a provision for the director's contingency, which allows us to support any unanticipated expenditures, any key initiatives, as well as assisting with any unfunded COVID-19 related costs. And the budget, of course, always assumes adherence to the Education Act, the enveloping provisions, and the guidelines for all ministry-related funding. With respect to COVID-19, the board has also had to make some assumptions in the development of the budget. And these assumptions include, first off, that enhanced health and safety protocols will be required for the 21-22 school year, that staff and students will be required to wear some form of personal protective equipment, that the board will not be a designated board. Therefore, classes will continue to run in a format based on a regular school day at both the secondary and the elementary levels. That a remote learning option will be available to all students. We're also assuming that international travel restrictions will still be in place in some format, and this will result in an impact to our international student enrollment. We are also assuming that schools will remain open for the full school year, and that enhanced health and safety protocols will continue for student transportation purposes. Now I would like to use this opportunity or take this opportunity to share with you some of the risks and challenges with developing the 21-22 budget. The budget represents an estimate of revenues and expenses for the 12 months ending August 31st, 2022. The budget is predicated on a series of assumptions which may or may not materialize. Adjustments to the budget are made as part of the annual revised estimate submission to the Ministry of Education that is completed in December of each year. This slide outlines the key risks and challenges to the budget, which will be discussed in further detail in the next few slides. Clearly, COVID-19 is a risk to this budget. The state of the pandemic, vaccination rates, and ministry direction on required health and safety measures may have an impact on the budget, which differs from the underlying assumptions that have been used for its development. Ministry guidance is not anticipated until midsummer in terms of what will be required for a reopening of schools in September, and this is after we have submitted the budget for 21-22. It is also important to recognize that school boards may only budget for 1/2 of the COVID supports announced by the ministry as part of their budget submissions. Remote learning is another risk and challenge for the budget. One of the elements affecting that is the timing of our parent and guardian survey, which follows the submission of the budget for 21-22. And that survey will inform the enrollment for the remote learning that will be offered by the board. And of course, we are aware that there are different cost structures associated with the various learning models. A key driver of the grant calculation is enrollment. In the elementary panel for 21-22, we are anticipating a decrease of 787 average daily enrollment, or ADE, for when you compare from budget to budget. Elementary enrollment projections were completed earlier this year when you compare to the prior year, because last year our budget submission to the ministry wasn't due until the end of August of 2020. So timing could be a factor in the enrollment decline that we are projecting. Additionally, the board has identified that there is delayed registrations, particularly in full-day kindergarten, and that is reflected in the enrollment projections. Other factors that influence the enrollment decline include decisions to engage in homeschooling and some students who may be returning to their country of origin. In the secondary panel for 21-22, the board is projecting an increase of 162 average daily enrollment comparing budget to budget. This is offset by a decrease in secondary visa students of 53 average daily enrollment. It is unknown at the time of budget development if international travel restrictions will be lifted or modified, and how that would impact international student enrollment. For purposes of the budget, only actual international student enrollments that have been registered with the board are reflected in the secondary projection. And this slide just provides a graph of the combined elementary and secondary projected enrollment. Special education poses a risk, again, for the budget. Special education is typically underfunded, and the board reallocates non-envelope funding to support the changing and the greater needs of students in our system. For 21-22, the funding deficit for special education is projected to be $3.8 million. Utilities also poses a risk for the budget as well. Unpredictable weather and force majeure events have an impact on the budget and on the amount of utility usage. Changes in legislation relating to utility use, for example, the carbon tax, energy market trends, and utility provider infrastructure expenses also would have an impact on utility prices. And in addition, it is assumed that the Ministry of Education would support and would require boards to continue to run their ventilation schedules for a longer period of time so that we can maximize the ventilation rates as a result of COVID-19. This again has an impact on the utility prices for the board. Supply chain and commodity pricing is also another risk. The economy is trending towards an inflationary market where commodity prices are increasing and demand for products and services is exceeding supply. This may have a negative impact to the budget. Additionally, we are seeing the inability of contractors and suppliers to commit to pricing over a longer period of time. WSIB is another risk for the budget. The board is a Schedule II employer under the WSIB Act and assumes responsibility for the payment of all claims to its injured workers under the Act. The board does not fund these obligations in advance of the payments. As costs continue to rise and the complexity of work-related injuries rises, there is a risk that claims and costs are greater than budgeted. Claims, grievances, and legal settlements are also a risk to this budget. The unanticipated nature of claims makes it unpredictable, obviously, for purposes of projecting in the budget. And there are challenges associated with assessing the likelihood of loss and the ability to reasonably estimate the dollar amount of a loss. Additionally, there are certain claims that are not subject to a limitation period, which continuously provides exposure to the board. Aging infrastructure is a recurring risk to the budget, simply due to the unanticipated repairs and maintenance issues that may come up with respect to having older facilities within the board. Significant renewal needs have been identified, and you can see that on the chart to the right. Clearly, as we replace schools and we engage in capital construction, this does reduce the dollar amount associated with aging infrastructure, but it is something that we do need to be mindful of. The board's liabilities for retirement benefits and retirement gratuities are actuarially determined. Changes in actuarial assumptions and discount rates over the actuarially determined liabilities for retirement benefits and retirement gratuities may have either a positive or a negative impact on the budget. And the last risk that we have identified for purposes of the presentation for the budget is associated with the upcoming provincial election, which is scheduled for June of 2022. The impact of a provincial election may stall or slow down certain approvals or initiatives within the ministry, or it may alternatively lead to new funding announcements. But there is that level of uncertainty that's associated with it that provides a risk. And at this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to Mr. Mayhew to discuss the board's funding allocation.
Okay, good evening, everyone. The next section will look at the board's overall funding allocation and examine significant funding changes in the model and other funding sources. This slide reviews the board's overall draft budget position. We're presenting a draft operating budget of $486.1 million for the 21-22 school year, representing a deficit of $4.27 million or 1% of our operating revenue allocation. We're presenting a draft capital budget, a balanced capital budget of $84 million for the 21-22 school year. And of course, as we do each year, we're drawing down our accumulated capital surplus by the amount of amortization of the committed capital projects that were funded by the board directly. That's LaSalle and Public School and Better Places, and that's a reduction of that surplus of $887,000. It's always the board's objective to ensure the budget is presented and it is in compliance with the ministry requirements. Compliance is discussed in section 1.9 of the budget memo. Section 231 of the Education Act defines compliance as in-year deficits that are the lesser of the accumulated surplus from the preceding year or 1% of the board's operating revenue. As discussed, the ministry amended this to be the lesser of 2% of operating revenue for the current year to address COVID-19 and is proposing a similar amendment for the upcoming year. However, for initial budget purposes, the ministry has communicated to the two boards that they're only able to budget for 1% of operating revenue. Additional changes will be reflected in the revised estimates based on ministry guidance. A non-compliance budget would require minister approval and requires a deficit recovery plan. As this slide shows, the board has presented a budget that is in compliance with the deficit requirements, as well as all other aspects of compliance. This slide provides an overview of the operating revenues and expenditures. As you can see, the majority of the board's funding comes directly from the grants for student needs, and we'll examine that in more detail on this slide. This slide provides an overview of the board's share of each element of the GSN. We will review the details and changes in each area in subsequent slides. However, the $432 million in the GSN is typically just grouped into four main areas, which are specific education priorities, local system needs, funding for schools, and funding for classrooms. This chart provides a detailed walk when comparing the previous approved budget of the 2021 budget to the current year draft budget. Budget to budget, there's an increase in funding of $4.6 million. I won't spend much time on this slide as the significant changes are reviewed in more detail. However, a couple items to note. As enrollment is a key driver of funding throughout the GSN, you will see that many components of funding are affected or decreased due to the projected decrease in enrollment. Where allocations provide for staffing supports, benchmarks have been increased to align with collective agreement increases. And that's representative of the 1% wage increases for most employee groups. With respect to COVID-19 supports, at the time the budget was passed last year, there was only $1.87 million announced for COVID-19. Subsequently, the board received more throughout the year as reflected and reported. COVID supports, which our board is permitted to budget for, is $3.9 million. This is why there's an increase of the 1.9 shown for COVID. Also, it is important to note increases in grants that may be temporary in nature, and I'll draw your attention to the language allocation increase of $1.6 million and the declining enrollment grant of $1 million. Both of these grants provide temporary support, and we will discuss this in future slides. A new student technology devices per pupil amount, $7.11, is provided in the Pupil Foundation Grant to support technology-related costs. This funding will help to replace some devices that may be out of date and support the procurement of additional student devices. Also, funding for additional educational software licensing is included in the GSN to support learning in and outside of a classroom. The board receives the minimum of $50,000 of funding for this purpose. It was $30,000 in the prior year. The impact of these funding increases totals $273,000. Due to the extraordinary and temporary decline in recent immigration enrollment as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and closed borders, time-limited mitigation funding is being provided to supplement the recent immigrant component of the English as a second language English Literacy Development, or ESL/ELD allocation. This funding is expected to help school boards continue to offer the same level of support to students requiring ESL/ELD programs. The recent immigrant supplement will ensure school boards generate minimum funding based on total weighted enrollment for each of the 4 years that generated funding through the recent immigrant component in the 2019-20 financial statements. School boards will generate top-up funding to get to this minimum if actual weighted enrollment falls below this level. And this represents a funding increase of approximately 1.6 compared to the prior year. The ministry is providing funding in 21-22 to support student mental health to foster the continued learning and well-being of students. This funding is in addition to PPF amounts for special education, mental health and well-being, and equity initiatives for temporary COVID-19 funding supports. This funding is provided through a new supporting student mental health allocation within the mental health and well-being grant. This funding, totaling $149,000, replaces mental health supports amounts previously received through PPF. The salary benchmarks throughout the GSN have been increased by 1%, excluding the director, senior administration staff, and principals, vice principals. This funding increase is directly offset by increased salary expenses. The impact of these funding increases for teachers only is approximately $1.7 million. In discussing this slide, it's important before we start to differentiate between online and remote learning. Both of these occur in a virtual world on a computer. Online refers to the mandatory 2 courses, and remote refers to learning via virtual school, learning at home. So when we're talking about this particular impact, we're referring to the online learning or mandatory 2 courses. As announced in fall of 2019, students will be required to take 2 online credits to graduate from secondary school, starting with students entering grade 9 in September of 2020. Starting in 21-22, the ministry is changing the funding methodology for online courses by adjusting benchmark funding for classroom teacher staffing through the secondary pupil foundation allocation and related grants based on a differentiated funding average class size for online and in-person learning. Based on the average class size of 30 online learning, the secondary benchmark will use funded average credit load of 7.5 credits per pupil, split between online learning and in-person learning. Under this new approach, the online learning adjustment in the cost adjustment and teacher qualifications and experience grant will be eliminated. As a result, a funding decrease of approximately $228,000 is included in the Pupil Foundation grant as a result of the online learning. The average teacher qualifications and experience, that's the placement of teachers on the salary grid, continues to increase. Additional funding of $1.1 million is budgeted for the cost adjustment and teacher qualifications and experience grant. This funding, though, is directly offset by an increase in salaries expense. Also, an increase in the benefits trust allocation of $494,000 is included in the budget to compensate for the increased benefit expenses for employee health life trusts. The declining enrollment adjustment, or the DEA, provides school boards with transitional support, recognizing that it takes time for school boards to adjust their cost structures to reflect declines in enrollment. Included in the budget is $1.58 million of DEA funding. It was $560,000 in the prior year, as enrollment is projected to be less than enrollment reported in the fall of 2020 as part of the revised estimate submission. This grant may be eliminated if actual enrollment in 21-22 is greater than projected. An increase of $472,000 is budgeted in the Indigenous Education Grant. This is primarily due to an increase in the number of students enrolled in the NBE 3C course, which is the English Contemporary Aboriginal Voices Grade 11 College Prep course. School boards are required to deliver courses within the native languages curriculum if a minimum of 8 secondary pupils of the school board enroll in the course. This funding allows the board to provide more Indigenous programming and education for all students, building knowledge on Indigenous histories, cultures, perspectives, and contributions. The increase in funding is offset by direct investments in Indigenous programming. New in 21-22, the Indigenous Languages and First Nations Inuit Studies allocation is fully enveloped grant to ensure funds are directed to support Indigenous learning, and we have increased the expenses accordingly to offset this funding. As a result of the global pandemic, there has been a decrease in enrollment in the international students program. Travel restrictions and safety concerns have resulted in students leaving the program. Also, there is a decrease in new student registrations compared to the prior year. At the time the budget was completed, enrollment of international students was projected using actual student registrations. No new international students were budgeted. As a result, the budget includes a decrease of 52 average daily enrollments compared to the prior year, budget representing a decrease in tuition fees of $578,000, and that's net, of course, of the ministry clawback of $1,300 per pupil. So this is a conservative estimate for international student tuition. We sure hope that we see some gains in this area as we move forward. An amount of $943,000 has been budgeted as a revenue representing funding from the Government of Canada under Jordan's Principle for the recovery of salaries and benefits paid to educational assistants who provide direct support to Indigenous students. It was $601,000 in the prior year. And in the current year, that represents support for 19 full-time EA positions. Total PPF revenue is budgeted to decrease $294,000. Included in the decrease is $94,000 representing prior year PPF that has been transferred to the GSN. That's the After School Skills Development Program. Therefore, net funding is budgeted to decrease $200,000. And I'll turn it back over to Superintendent Armstrong.
Thanks, Sean. The next few slides, we're going to just walk through and outline how the budget supports the strategic priorities of the board. Next slide, please. So our strategic priorities of the board, they're always considered throughout the development of the budget and throughout the budget process, because it's very important that we align the budget to those priorities. And student success and well-being is at the core of all the work that we do, including the budget. Next slide. The 21-22 budget reflects investments to support creating confident learners through a variety of investments. I would like to invite Director Kelly to speak to the first investment that is noted on this slide.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. It's my pleasure to talk about a position that I'm advocating for, and certainly this is something that I have thought of for a while. It's a Human Rights and Equity Advisor position. This would be something that would be coming out of the Director's contingency, and as I've said earlier in the budget's discussions, that equity needs to be a priority as we're moving forward, and that would be the use of the Director's contingency. To clarify, while we have a diversity officer, this would be a different position. This would be a senior leadership position wherein at a system level, wherein somebody would have extensive training in sort of supervising complaint procedures, for example, and would perhaps have a legal background and a strong background in human rights and strategic planning around equity initiatives. So this is the kind of thing that they have in a couple of Ontario school boards. Well, I can think of Toronto definitely does, Halton and Niagara over the last year. And this is a kind of position I think our board would benefit from to have a stronger look in the area of equity. So that was my advocacy for something in that area in the terms of equity. And I know I talked to Chair Higginson a while ago about the need to have more resources in this area and someone with a legal and higher level kind of lens on these items. So just wanted to explain that.
Thank you, Director Kelly. Additional investments to support creating confident learners within the budget include the addition of 11 FTE, full-time equivalent, special education supports to address student needs, 7 Jordan's principal educational assistants to provide direct support to our Indigenous students, an increase of 2.0 FTE full-time equivalent re-engagement attendance counselors to review attendance and engage with students and parents to ensure continued student education and success, an increase of 6.0 FTE information technology positions to support students and staff with the increasing demands of technology, for example, supporting remote learning, ensuring connectivity, and access to programs and software. The budget also provides for an investment of 2 FTE Indigenous academic instructors and approximately $84,000 in supplies and resources to improve student enrichment in Indigenous culture and history. There's also an added investment of 3.0 FTE graduation coaches to address service delivery gaps and to facilitate the engagement and well-being and academic achievement of our Black students. As well, there is also an investment in a STEPS classroom at Massey Secondary School and Gaines classrooms at General Brock Public School and Princess Elizabeth Public School. The 21-22 budget also includes investments to support engaging communities through a variety of measures. These include the introduction of a new communications officer position to increase social media and website presence, an additional investment of $70,000 in equity and inclusion supports, which include training, resources, and supplies, an investment of $250,000 for a new board website to improve communication and to provide better accessibility of information, additional supports in the area of technology, Indigenous education, and diversity, for example, graduation coaches, to facilitate improved engagement with respective communities. And there's the addition also of the equity advisor position that Director Kelly just mentioned. As well, in 21-22, for the budget, the board piloted a budget survey to obtain feedback from the community as part of the budget development process to determine what stakeholder groups value and support. In the 21-22 budget, there are a variety of initiatives that demonstrate our commitment to ethical stewardship. These include an increase of $2 million for a director's contingency to address emerging issues such as anti-Black racism, diversity, equity and inclusion, mental health, safe schools, and to provide additional supports as necessary for COVID-19. There's also an additional $100,000 of resources such as textbooks and online resources for new schools and programs. The budget also reflects the creation of 2 FTE new construction administrator positions to coordinate capital projects and ensure that new school builds are completed on budget and are properly maintained and operating efficiently. A commitment to healthy schools is also reflected through the application and award of $15.6 million of COVID resilience infrastructure funding to improve building systems such as ventilation, bottle filling stations, cooling centers, door hold open projects, childcare upgrades, and Wi-Fi access points. The elimination of single-use plastic products from the board's web stock purchasing system is also an initiative that demonstrates ethical stewardship. And lastly, this budget reflects the maintenance of a healthy accumulated surplus to ensure that the board is positioned to address unanticipated expenditures and contingencies that may arise. Next slide. And with that, I would be happy to turn the presentation over to Mr. Mayhew to take you through the operating expenses.
Okay, the next set of slides will review changes in budgeted operating expenses. Again, we are comparing the prior year approved budget to the current year draft budget. This pie chart breaks down expenses into the categories shown on the slide. And I'll just note that consistent with prior years, approximately 80% of the budget represents salaries and benefits. Similar to the funding chart that we went through, this chart provides a walk from the 2021 budget to the 21-22 budget for expenses. In total, budgeted expenses have increased $4.6 million. I'll briefly walk through some of the major changes, which will be discussed in further detail to follow. You'll note here that one of the most significant changes are all the staffing positions that we've discussed. A decrease in total positions, which we'll go through shortly. 28.7 FTE results in a decrease of $3.2 million. There's been increases in grid and grid placement. That is an increase of $3.5 million. There's increases in benefit costs due to rising cost of EHLT contributions or payments to those under the collective agreements, and also increases in CPP and EI. So all those are accounted for in increase in benefits. We've increased the occasional teachers line by a little over $500,000 to bring the budgeted expense more in line with the trend that we're seeing for actual expenditures for occasional teachers. There's a decrease in agent fees as a result of a decrease in the amount of international students budgeted. We spoke about the increase in the Indigenous supplies budget. We also spoke about the increase in the equity and inclusion budget, the new website. The specialist high skills amount of $478,000. That increase is a little bit of an illusion because the amount was moved out of a PPF into the GSN, and that PPF is typically announced later in the year, so it's not usually captured in our budget. So these expenses are just offset by the funding that's been moved into the funding formula. There's the increase in the director's contingency of $2 million, which we've discussed. The school opening supplies. A decrease in employment services, that's offset by a decrease in revenues, and we'll speak to that later. An increase in amortization, that is offset by revenue as well that we bring in. When we capitalize the revenue, we capitalize the asset, and the two are offset when we amortize the asset. Change in interest on our debt charges, which is offset by a change in revenues as well. We'll speak to COVID expenses in some slides to come. We spoke about the decrease in PPF, and there's some other net changes. And we'll talk a bit more about this compliance calculation adjustment, which is new for the current year. And essentially, that's our drawdown of our capital surplus set aside for LaSalle. Public school and better places. That we used to have to reserve for that in our compliance calculation when determining our 1% allocation that we could use. That no longer exists in 21-22, so we get the benefit of that amount moving forward. Note that the next two slides, we'll go through the staffing complement changes. It's important to recognize that staffing, again, is 80% of our budget. So it's vital to understand the changes in staffing because, as I mentioned before, going through this, that has a major impact on the budget. Note the next two slides do not reflect the addition of the equity advisor position, which Director Kelly mentioned earlier. So just keep that in mind as we walk through here. That position is not, that increase is not included in here. I also want to note that these changes represent positions and not necessarily headcount. These changes are changes in full-time equivalent. For example, there may be 2 half or part-time staff members that represent 1 FTE. Elementary teachers are budgeted to decrease 39 FTE as a result of the projected decrease in enrollment. Secondary teachers are budgeted to decrease 1.7 FTE due to meeting class size, section requirements, and account for the online learning adjustment. ECs are budgeted to decrease 17 FTE as a result of the decrease in FDK enrollment. EAs are budgeted to increase 12 FTE, 7 which are directly funded by Jordan's principal, as we've mentioned, and 5 are for system needs such as new gains and STEPS programs. Professional and other educational support staff are budgeted to increase 16 FTE, and that is 2 re-engagement counselors, 1 DSW to support the Massey STEPS program, 5 support workers for the deaf and hard of hearing to support students who require sign language interpretation. That's direct support. 2 Indigenous academic instructors, 2 media resource technicians funded by the investment in system priority. So that's those are directly funded by the collective agreements. 4 FTE on one-year contracts, which are IT positions, 2 technicians and 2 software support analysts, and that's to support the increase in technology needs in the system, both for staff and students. Consultants are budgeted to increase by 3 FTE, representing the 3 additional graduation coaches to support outcomes for Black students. No change in budgeted principals. VPs are budgeted to decrease by 4.5 as a result of a decrease in enrollment. Again, just to emphasize, FTE is not representative of persons in this case. Schools that may have been staffed with 0.75 VP time might have dropped down to 0.5 based on enrollment, and that additional time shifts to their instruction or in classroom time. Clerical is budgeted to decrease by 2 FTE. 1 represents a decrease in elementary clerk hours due to a decrease in enrollment, and the other 1 position is a budget correction. Believe it or not, us accountants do make mistakes, so we try and review the budget on an annual basis to make sure that we adjust for any errors or omissions that may exist in the budget. Facility services staff are budgeted to increase by 2.5. That's 1.5 additional custodians for additional space and portables at Legacy Oak and Essex Public, and 2 construction administrators to manage all the capital projects, which are increasing at the same rate as technology, it seems. And that's offset by a decrease of 1 FTE skilled tradesperson due to attrition. The increase of 3 administration represents a transfer of 1 from the other professional line below. You'll see a decrease in the line below it. 1 communications officer, as we've discussed, 2 additional IT support, a database administrator, and a help desk team lead, and a decrease of 1 board planner. And in total, that summarizes the total decrease of 28.7 FTE positions. And when we include that back in that 1 position that Director Kelly mentioned, it's a decrease of 27.7. Support for Students Fund and the Investment in System Priorities Fund supports 44 positions in the system as shown on this slide. This funding was negotiated through the collective bargaining process and continues for the 21-22 school year. This is the last year of the agreements. These additional supports would not continue in 22-23 unless negotiated in the next round of bargaining. When we put all the funding and expenses together, this is how it turns out. As we've mentioned, a deficit that totals of $4.27 million, representing 1% of our total operating allocation. And you'll see that our opening balance and our accumulated surplus is projected as of September 1st, 2021 to be a little over 22 million. And when you factor in that budgeted deficit of 4.2, you end up with still that healthy reserve of $18 million in our operating surplus. The decrease in the capital surplus no longer impacts compliance. As I alluded to earlier, you'll see the in and out there, whereas we used to have to adjust or consider that in our compliance calculation. The decrease in the capital amount, which is the amortization, is adjusted out so that our compliance operating deficit is the 4.2. The next slides review COVID-19 as it pertains to the 21-22 budget. As I've mentioned, boards are required to budget for 1/2 of the resources for the first half of the school year. Makes it a little bit difficult when you're trying to budget for a full year. This was a lot of feedback from school boards were that this is a little unusual, a little challenging, and the feedback from the ministry was that they would consider the additional 50% as part of the revised estimate submission. Again, boards may access up to 2%. However, we're only being asked to budget for 1%. Anything greater than the 1% would be considered out of compliance for this initial preliminary for the budget. Again, something to be considered at revised estimates. As presented in section 1.5, the ministry is continuing funding supports for COVID-19. Investments through PPF totaling $3.9 million, or approximately 50% of the board's allocated amount of 7.5 million. That's excluding supports for re-engaging students and reading assessment supports. You'll see we're allowed to take in to account 100% of that amount, the 346. At the time of the 2021 budget, only 1.86 million of COVID funding was announced and included. Therefore, budget to budget, we show a total increase of $1.9 million. Total funding is directly offset by incremental COVID-19 expenses in recognition that the 21-22 school year may require similar health and safety measures as those implemented in the current school year. The ministry has allocated the COVID-19 funding as it's shown on this slide. Funding for additional staff may be used for teachers, ECEs, custodial staff, school-based administrative support, principals, vice principals, to support smaller cohorts. Funding to support school operations is intended to cover additional costs, such as running ventilation systems longer, increased filter changes. Transportation funding is to support enhanced cleaning on school buses and maintenance of ongoing health and safety protocols. Funding for re-engaging students and reading assessments supports provide a minimum of $20,000 per school board plus an amount based on the ADE. Funding for connectivity supports is an application-based program to support connectivity improvements within school buildings, and further details are to be announced. You'll see that's why it's marked with a TBD. And now I'm going to briefly walk through the appendices that are part of your budget memo. We've already discussed a lot of the changes with respect to funding and expenses. However, as they're presented in the appendices, it might show up a little differently. So I think it's important just to highlight some of the significant changes that might pop out on these schedules. We've walked through the changes in budgeted teacher expenses quite thoroughly. That's Appendix 6 and shows the change year over year and the cost of teaching. Appendix 1 shows the occasional cost for teachers and the budgeted increase, as I've mentioned, of $540,000. We've reviewed these staffing changes. However, in Appendix 7, those staffing changes specifically are what impacts the major areas, and we'll discuss that in a moment. The board continues to invest, as Superintendent Armstrong mentioned, resources to maintain and improve special education programming. Unenveloped funding is used to offset a deficit in this area. And I really the biggest unenveloped or non-enveloped grant that comes to mind is the Pupil Foundation grant. That's where we get a majority of our funding, and that would be the primary source of allocation of resources to offset, or funding to offset the special education deficit. And I just want to add too that when we look at the spec ed deficit, we look at it year over year. So it really hasn't, we've always maintained a deficit. So we didn't necessarily have to cut anything year over year to account for this deficit, but it obviously is a big problem and maintains and continues to be a problem, a risk to the budget, because it does not allow us to reutilize these resources or this funding that we have to get to other areas to create new programs, improve programs, etc. So to the extent that funding doesn't increase, we always have to reserve some of that to offset the deficit. Appendix 7, as we mentioned, is the budget for EAs, professionals, and other educational support staff. We reviewed those FTE changes. And those staffing changes, as discussed, represent an increase of $769,000. There's benefit increases on the entire staffing complement of $583,000, and grid position changes account for $785,000. This budget, this portion of the budget remains fairly consistent. Again, school aids assumes a typical learning model. As we've seen, if that changes, we tend to use less, and that budget would be adjusted at revised if we become aware that we are using less part-time school aids. And we'll move to Appendix 8. Appendix 8 looks at the textbooks, classroom supplies, and other related classroom expenses. Just some highlights here. There's continued supports for the IB program and other board initiatives. You'll see we've maintained those amounts. There's $100,000, as mentioned, for budget increase for new learning materials for the new schools, new Legacy Oak Trail, for example, and other new programming. $70,000 increase is in this schedule for the equity and inclusion. $84,000 we've discussed is included in this appendix for Indigenous programming. And again, we've talked about the decrease in agent fees as a result of less international students year over year. On this slide, you'll see that there's a slight decrease in outdoor ed funding or expenses, and that's offset by a slight decrease in the funding. There's a $25,000 decrease in pass rent as we're currently using owned facilities for the time being. There's $62,000 to cover increased technology costs, software and licensing. And as mentioned, the specialist high skills major, what used to be the PPF is shifted into the GSN. So we've increased our expenses by $479,000 to account for that increase in funding year over year. And as we've mentioned, also included in the school information technology support amount is $250,000 for the new website. Finally, on the last portion of Appendix 8, all really investments in these areas continue. You'll see here, though, there's the $2 million added to the director's contingency that we've talked about, this representing a portion of the 1% deficit to ensure the budget is available to address the incremental expenses that may arise, such as anti-Black racism, remote learning models, incremental utilities, additional mental health supports, other incremental COVID-related costs. A decrease of $25,000 is budgeted for 21-22 and represents a decrease in NTIP, and that's in the professional development line. That's the new teachers induction program, and that's offset by a decrease in funding as less teachers qualify for this funding compared to the prior year. That makes sense, of course. Funding's based on teachers with 2 years less. 2 years or less experience, and as we see teachers continuing to gain experience, we have the higher qualifications and experience grant. It makes sense that we get less money for that professional development for the new teachers. The changes in this slide are discussed in schedule section 3.2 of the binder. The changes in salaries and benefits have been discussed in previous sections, and that's for the vice principals, the secretaries, and the consultants being the increase of 3 for grad coaches. And again, there's a continued investment in computers and ergo for secretaries. You'll see that amount under that section. The director and SO line, I'll just mention this decrease in salaries and benefits primarily relates to the reclassification of expenses to the teacher consultants line, which is Appendix 9, to match funding for the program leadership grant. It's just matching up where the funding source is with the expense. So there's a little bit of shift there because, as we mentioned, there's no increases really scheduled increases for the directors and SOs. In the admin line, you'll see a $221,000 increase. That's related to IT fees and licensing fees, such as ECNO. Those rates go up with scheduled contract increases. And also consulting costs for board planning have been reallocated to the admin line from the salaries line, which is a portion of that $221,000 increase. Salaries on Appendix 10 here, salary changes are a result of the FTE changes discussed previously and grid increases and changes to the grid. Benefits have changed based on the FTE and based on increased benefit rates. Continue to budget for $1.1 million of casual custodians. Debenture interest continues to decrease as loans are paid off on LaSalle Public School and Better Place debentures. The increase in insurance for OSB premiums is something we're all expecting. We know about. We brought a previous report to the board, so we budgeted for that increase. And we budgeted for an increase of approximately $312,000 in utilities. However, that's offset by reductions in other areas such as maintenance and operations. This amount, Appendix 13 here, represents the operation portion of the total renewal funding of $6.3 million. The remainder of the amount is included in the capital budget. We just have to account for which portion of renewal is operating in nature based on the capitalization guidelines. A slight decrease in transportation expenses are budgeted based on route efficiencies identified by the Windsor-Essex Student Transportation Consortium. The board shares in transportation expenses with the 3 other local boards based on student ridership. And you'll see also there's a slight increase in budgeted Con Ed expenses, and this is offset by additional funding. This is the miscellaneous government grants is our employment services division with offices in Windsor and Leamington. These programs are delivered throughout the school year and include employment services to help people in Windsor-Essex County find work, and other services providing assessments for adult English language proficiency. And we budgeted for that decrease to align with the total grants, and expenses of the program directly offset the revenues from the program. Appendix 2 provides a summary of other revenue and expenses. This is essentially the non-GSN funding sources and expenses, such as PPFs, other ministry funding, other sources. We've reviewed most of these. However, just to highlight a couple, you'll see again the COVID-19 line last year was only $1.8 million of funding. And we budgeted for a full 1% use of our surplus in that line. This year, the board has budgeted COVID expenses to equal the funding exactly, which is the $3.9 million. You'll notice graduation coach funding has not been announced. However, the board has included all expenses related to this program, including the 3 additional FTE. So when we're expecting funding to be announced. When that funding is announced, we won't have to put additional expenses into the budget, so that's a positive. Miscellaneous revenue includes interest revenue, Jordan's principal, energy rebates, solar panel revenue, and other fees and discounts. And notice that's fairly consistent year over year. An increase in Jordan's principles offset by a decrease, I guess, in the level of energy rebates we expect next year. The decrease in tuition fees is shown on this slide as a result of a decrease in projected visa students. With respect to EDC and capital grant for land, you'll notice there's nothing in this year. That's because there's nothing planned for land acquisitions in the upcoming year, and as such, all EDC revenues received are therefore deferred. And in the prior year, I believe that capital grant for land related to North Shore. This slide shows the ministry compliance adjustments. Overall, the operating budget to note is $482 million, as we've discussed. We've reviewed a bit of the continuity already of the accumulated surplus. However, again, this portion of the appendix shows that continuity. It shows the $4.2 million of deficit that is budgeted in the 21-22 draft budget, and what the expected accumulated surplus will be at the end of next fiscal year. And of course, that depends on the outcome of the year we're in right now, the 2021 year. Because we budgeted to use 2% of our accumulated surplus, which is the 7.4. So if we don't fully use that entirely, then we'll have, I guess, a greater surplus come August 31st, 2022. And there's a few slides left just to talk about the capital budget, and I'll just provide a brief overview of the capital budget now. Funding primarily consists of school renewal, which is school condition improvement, school renewal allocation, the school operations allocation, temporary accommodation allocation, and the capital priorities. The capital items presented in this budget are fully funded. That's why expenses equals the funding you'll see in the appendix. Past projects that the board supported of LaSalle Public School, Better Schools, Energy Retrofit. Again, those have all been reserved for in our surplus, and we just draw that down. And again, amortization reduces that committed capital reserve that was set aside August 31st, 2018 to fully pay off the capital deficit. So we don't have a capital deficit. That's a positive. And when you're looking at budget to budget, looking at capital, you'll see an increase, which is also a positive. So the big areas which really help us out, school condition improvement, renewal, those are all maintained, which is great for our board because we have those infrastructure needs. And you'll see our capital priorities are continuing to grow. We have a lot of new schools in the pipeline, and there's a lot of money as part of that program, $43 million that is approved and to use on those program or those schools that are specifically mentioned in the appendix. And with that, that concludes the presentation, and I will open it up to any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayhew, and of course, Superintendent Armstrong. I think just as a matter of procedure, I went back to our board meeting last year, and Chair Halberstadt asked for the motion to be put on the floor first, so before we took any questions. So I see Trustee Leclerc, you're jumping the gun a little bit. I'm just going to keep going through the agenda quickly, and then we'll get to that. So just for the sake of public record, there were no delegations at the time of the agenda approval, and then there is also nobody on the speakers list. So we are at item H1, which would be the approval of the 2021-22 budget as per the recommendation in all of our agendas. So I see Trustee Leclerc moving it, and I see Trustee Cook seconding it. So with that, again, I will offer thanks to our administration for preparing such a comprehensive presentation for us, and we will invite questions now from trustees. So I will go to Trustee Higgison. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much through you, Madam Chair. Thank you to administration for everybody's work in putting that together. I know in light of everything that we kind of went through this year, shifts and shifts back and then shifts back again, having this and having such a comprehensive presentation, not only this time, but for the public's knowledge, trustees have also been updated 2 or 3 times on this separately as well. And so I appreciate all the work that that went into that. My question is to kind of clarify a few of the points that we saw today, and to kind of, I'll be honest, to drive home the point of how disappointing some of the investments in public education have been from the ministry this year. I'll be very honest about that. That I think we're doing an exceptional job with what we have been given, and I am disappointed that there hasn't been a further investment in public education. But having said that, we know that there's a declining enrollment, a significant declining enrollment, and that it is a big concern to us. And so we know that there's due to that declining enrollment, or it's linked somewhat to where we see 27 FTE positions directly related to student supports and things that were needed in our schools. So given that restricted budget based on that average daily enrollment, where do we see in this budget that we have in front of us here the spending for re-engaging some of those students who, to Superintendent Armstrong's points earlier about those students who we have lost to things like homeschooling or things we have lost? I noted on page 29 there were references to impacts like the 15-day absences, things like that. Where do we see in this budget where we have had to pull from other funding sources in order to satisfy the needs that we have to re-engage some of those 788 students that we've lost? Where are we spending from other places? Are there several places in the GSNs that we are spending in order to re-engage those students in order to get them back? And what are some of the places where we can see that money being spent in other places in our budget?
Thank you for the question. I will try this one, and then I may pass it on to Mr. Mayhew and potentially Director Kelly. So you're correct. The budget is, I would say that the funding that we've been provided by the ministry is probably disappointing in some areas. And if we go back to the slide on the COVID funding, the ministry is providing funding for student re-engagement of approximately, I think it's $349,000. That's the only element that we can actually budget the full 100% for. Some of the initiatives that we are taking on, and you're absolutely right, getting back that enrollment that we're seeing decline is very, very important. I mean, some of that is from families that are choosing not to enroll their little ones in FDK at this time, because it's tricky when you're in the elementary school setting with respect to vaccinations, and students don't necessarily need to attend that portion of it. So I know that we do have, we've made a commitment for 2 re-engagement counselors for this school year, and the work to start engaging those students that have not been participating, that is continuing to go on even throughout the summer. The work with, by adding the graduation coaches as well, is also a way to connect and re-engage with our students. We continue to keep the investments with social workers, psychologists, all of those elements to try and support our students is very important as well, and that's reflected in here as well. In addition to the COVID funding support that we're getting of the $350,000. I don't know, Mr. Mayhew or perhaps Director Kelly, if you have anything further you'd like to add, please feel free.
I'll just add, thanks, Shelley. I'll just add one comment to that. The additional supports that Shelley mentioned, Superintendent Armstrong mentioned, are on top of the current investments that we've maintained in the budget too. So, for example, we already had one re-engagement attendance counselor that was budgeted, that was maintained. So the 2 adds to the 1 that exists. So we have 3 supports there to help that. And then also for the graduation coach, there was 1 already included in the budget, and we've added to that as well. So there were existing supports that it didn't show in the budget because we're looking budget over budget, so you don't see that increase. But there are continued supports there as well.
Yes, Director Kelly, I'd just like to add to that. I agree with the assessment given so far, but it will be a major priority for us to re-engage students that we have not been able to engage this year. And so that becomes a priority for principals, for teachers, for everybody as we come into the new year. And that's why we want to see all of our students back in our buildings as much as possible.
Thank you. Was there a follow-up to that, Trustee
Yeah,
Higginson?
I just had one supplemental if I could. Yes, so Superintendent Armstrong, you mentioned that the $349,000 coming from the COVID-19 funding. We are, to my knowledge, only allowed to budget for half of that, or $349,000 is the half that we are allowed to budget for. I'm increasingly confused about this, trying to budget with half of our dollars for a full year, as I'm sure you are. So I'm trying to make some sense of that. If you could clarify that for me.
Yes, through you, Madam Chair. It's a little wonky. So we're allowed to budget for 50% of the COVID supports, except for the re-engaging students allocation, where we can actually take the full amount in for the budget that we're submitting.
Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I'm just going to read the queue out so everybody is aware. It's Trustee Burgess, Trustee Chin, Trustee Halberstadt, then Trustee Olmsted. So I will go to Trustee Burgess next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll put my camera on. I do have some questions, and so I'll get back in the queue if I could. Some of them are for clarification. Some of the, well, all of them are for clarification. Some are for me to really, really understand, because I don't. So it's about enrollment and about the logistics around it. Normally, we would, pass our budget, and we would have had a very successful and robust kindergarten registration. We would have everybody moving from one grade to another. And if I looked at the enrollment dips, we would have been more like, 1920 enrollment, except for what has happened in families disengaging because of pandemic conditions in person and online, for that matter. So if, as I understand, our advocacy and re-engagement is going to happen immediately, but a lot of people are going to be off on July for a well-deserved recharge, and that's administration. I don't know, for our purposes, normally clerks and secretaries work through some of the summer, and some, but they do have some time off. I want to know the logistics of what's going to happen in July, because parents are making a decision in July. and the beginning of August, which will have significant impact on our staffing, which has to happen after that consultation and commitment to enrollment in August. And then we have reorg day, which is the day that we wait for everybody to actually show up, and then we restaff a bit if people have made a last minute commitment because they're waiting to see what the conditions are like after Labor Day, for example. So kindergarten kids don't come back till the second week in September. And then in October, we have reorg. I'm wondering about the logistics of the staffing and the money that flows in order to staff. And are we compromised in any additional way by saying by October, we're going to have many more kids there, but is it retroactive, reorg day, is it retroactive to make sure that we've got enough money to flow in order to make things happen in September and October for the additional staff? Because there's a lot of staff that are not coming back, as per this budget right now. But I think that will change. So could somebody help me understand how the money flows through that, and where we are for September and October, and what could possibly change after October?
Thank you, Trustee Burgess. I look to administration.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, Mr. Mayhew, if you wanted to try to explain that one, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So a lot to unpack there. I mean, again, just a reminder, when we're looking at enrollment, enrollment was projected at an earlier point this year than it was last year. So we had a bit of a benefit of time last year where we could capture late enrollments, we could capture late registrations. I think last year as well, we are at a state in a pandemic where there was a lot more uncertainty. So it's very, I would be hopeful that as we move forward, we would see some of those registrations come in, students re-engaged. I'm hoping some of that would, I'm trying to be positive that some of that would clear up itself. However, obviously we have those supports in place to generate that enrollment. When that enrollment does change, and we keep in mind, we take another snapshot in October. And when that snapshot's taken of enrollment in October, that will generate our revised estimates. So when we take that snapshot in October, we'll compare it to where we're at now, and obviously staffing will be done, reorg will be done in September, and we'll get the advantage of all those students that come into the system, hopefully increase, and we'll get the advantage of the additional grant monies at that time. So this is, again, it's hard to say exactly how that will turn out. Again, we're hopeful, but at the same time too, we always, when we approach the budget, we tend to be conservative. We always want to be conservative. We don't want to overestimate amounts. We don't want to overestimate enrollments. So again, as we move forward, we'll look at enrollment in October, adjust as necessary, and that will flow into the grants and will be part of the revised estimates that we'll bring to you at that time in the fall.
Superintendent Armstrong, through you, Madam Chair, if I might also add, our re-engagement counselors will be working throughout the summer to work to re-engage those students. And I'd like to invite Superintendent Mills also to speak to the work involved with staffing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. What I just wanted to mention is that we have had conversations with our principals about reaching out to those families, especially those JK families that disengaged during the year, our kindergarten families that disengaged through the year, also our homeschool families that chose that as an option. We want to welcome them back into our schools and make some of those connections right now. So we know a lot of our administrators, especially in the elementary panel, are doing that right now. One of the things that we did not have an opportunity to do last year because of the health conditions was that reorganization. So typically we see the students in the seats and then we do that recount. But because of where we were last year, we weren't able to do that. So we do anticipate, obviously doing some staffing in August around the elementary virtual school, but then we do get that opportunity to adjust our numbers, to adjust our staffing when we see how many students are actually sitting in the seats.
Thank you, Superintendent Mills, and to Superintendent Armstrong and Mr. Mayhew as well. Trustee Burgess, was there a supplemental there?
Not in the same line of questioning. I'll get back in the queue. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I will now go to Trustee Chin.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. My question is regarding the website. The budget for the new board website is 250,000. To my understanding, the website is not a commercial website. It's just for information, kind of communication, and I don't quite understand this level of budget, why it is so huge. And if we outsourced this website outside, it could be much lower, I think. And also we have already, add a communication officer last year. I wonder if you have reviewed the performance and the necessity of this position, because this communication officer plus the 250,000 investment, it equals to 3 dedicated positions. So I just don't understand why it is so much. Thank you.
It's Director Kelly through you, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, so we did talk about the cost of website. This is certainly within line and very competitive and will be a superior product. We are more than pleased with our communications person. We have much more traction on social media, and she's been able to add a lot of value, so we're really pleased by that. Superintendent Mills, do you have anything to add about the website? Because I know you've been in much more conversation and detail about the website, but it is within reason for something of this nature.
Yeah, exactly. We did put out an RFP, and we examined a number of companies. We came up with a company, eSolutions, that's doing our website right now. They've done a tremendous amount of work in a short period of time. We're going to be looking at some designs, some final designs, hopefully. And really the goal of that came out of the COVID Communication Committee last summer. And one of the things that we wanted to do was find a way to increase the communication on the board's website and make it accessible for people. Right now, one of the biggest complaints that we have is when you go to our website, you can't find the information that you need in a timely manner. We want to be able to make sure that it's very clear, that it's translatable, that it's accessible to our community. And the company that we've chosen is doing a great job so far with that. And very competitive when we look at other companies and the pricing.
Okay, thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair, just one more thing to add about the budget itself for the website. You'll recall at revised estimates last year, we actually did put an amount in for the website development that was determined at that time. We needed to reserve for that again in case it falls into next year. So I just want to be clear that it was already part of it. We were hoping to fully use those monies this year, but it's a big project that might take a long time. So if we can't get to, we had to make sure we provide for it in next year's budget. So just if you've heard that before, if you've seen that amount in the past, it's not a new amount. It's not over and above what we already talked about at revised estimates. It's just a budget to budget increase because it might fall into next year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Trustee Halberstadt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, my questioning at this point is with regard to the director's contingency. And I'm wondering, what is the normal contingency? This one is $2 million. So what has it been in past years?
Director Kelly, I could look. It's been certainly a bit less, I think in maybe more than $1 million range. But again, we really wanted to focus on have that buffer given our change this year. And also I wanted to note too that that equity position will be a top priority and would come out of that money.
Okay, would there be anything left over from the 2 million or 2 million one, I guess it's looked at. There any left over? We keep hearing about the unfunded special ed programs. It's 3.8 million this year. Why couldn't we borrow from that line to help balance the special ed deficit or underfunding, which is getting tired. I'm getting tired of hearing about it. You hear about it every year, and nothing too much seems to happen about it.
Yeah, through you, Trustee Halberstadt, you're correct. We do often overspend in special education. It continues to be an issue. In the past, sometimes the extra special education staffing has actually come out of the director's contingency. That has happened in the past. I think last year maybe 10 positions came out of that, if I'm right, Mr. Mayhew. I could be wrong. But again, that would be something we would use if we incurred extra costs in the area of special education, which indeed we have. We have, for example, in the area of Lexia, if you recall the reading programs that we used to support, especially, I think there was a huge amount of money that came out of that to support that as well. So what I'm hearing from you is special education should be a priority for some of that funding. And I agree where there are initiatives that need support, like the Lexia, like the things that we've done in the past. Superintendent Wilcox usually comes my way. So thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, just a supplementary, I guess, to Sean. Sean, you said this, and I'm sometimes a little confused. Envelope money is where you're looking at funding special ed this year, or in future year and past years also. Could you explain what envelope money exactly is? And it appears that this money is being drawn for special ed has been drawn from other budgets, including the contingency, I guess, of the directors.
Through you, Madam Chair. Thanks for the question. Yes, that's correct, Trustee Halberstadt. The special education grant is one that is fully enveloped, meaning an envelope means that it must be used for its intended purpose, and also that we have to report on that specifically. So we have to tell the ministry exactly how we're using that funding and support that funding. Should we not use all the funding, we have to defer that funding. Again, back to special education, it's not uncommon for boards to show a deficit in this area. I'm not sure there's many boards that would even have a surplus. Of course, I think it was $3.8 million isn't a small deficit by any means, and we would hope to want to reduce that. However, again, let me just go back to the problem we're in with declining enrollment. You've got a grant, special education, that's highly dependent upon enrollment to generate some of the funding for special education. Yet if enrollment decreases and needs increase, the funding works in the opposite way of your model and your expenses. So that's a continuing problem. Where we would look to fund that deficit is unenveloped areas or non-enveloped areas of the GSN. Primarily, as I mentioned, the pupil foundation amount provides a majority of the funding for in-classroom supports. We would use likely that area of funding to cover the deficit, such that the deficit is not causing the board to be in a greater deficit overall. I hope that explains it.
Not totally, but I guess I'll have to take your word for it that I would hate to see us undercut special ed funding for some other areas, including the director's contingency, to be honest with you.
Through you, Madam Chair, I mean, I think the budget displays our commitment to special education. I wouldn't say that you're right, we're underfunded. We're not underexpensed, I don't believe. I think we've added resources. If you look at all the supports that we've added in the area of special education, there's quite a bit of resources added. I think we ensure that students and the support students need in that area are maintained and increased in accordance with need, regardless of what the funding is, and we try and draw from those areas that we can.
Thank you, Mr. Yeah,
I'll come back later.
Thanks, Trustee Halberstadt. I was just going to jump in to say, if I'm understanding Mr. Mayhew correctly, it's not that we're not allocating money towards that gap, it's that we're underfunded by the ministry, and that's a consistent problem. So it's not our board shortchanging that envelope, so to speak, but just to make sure that I'm understanding. Okay, I'm getting the thumbs. Okay. I hope that clarifies things. I'll go to Trustee Olmsted next.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me? My internet's a little bit choppy this evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Oh, thank you very much. So my concern was the same as Trustee Halberstadt. As a member of SEAC, I know that when Mr. Mayhew came and presented the special education budget, there were many concerns that were raised about the shortfall, which Mr. Mayhew noted that day and tonight again that this is nothing new. Our needs have increased, but our funding has not. And therefore, we need to draw from other lines to cover the needs of our learners. So is it necessary, once again, to advocate to the ministry, expressing our concerns about this lack of funding by writing a letter and by really advocating that the needs of our learners has increased extraordinarily, and therefore our funding needs to be increased as well?
Thank you. I will direct that question to administration if they would like to comment on it.
Through you, Madam Chair, certainly if that is something that the trustees would like to do. It's a risk that we note in the budget consistently year over year. To clarify, absolutely, there is a funding gap when you look at what is required to meet the needs of those learners relative to the funding that we receive. We always fill that gap, and we do that through any of the non-enveloped funding that's available through the Pupil Foundation grant. But it is an issue, absolutely. And so certainly if that's something that trustees wish to do, certainly you could do that.
Thank you, Superintendent Armstrong, and thank you for that suggestion, Trustee Olmsted. I may note that we typically send a letter at the end of our budget meeting, so I'm seeing, so I will make note of things that we might want to include in that letter, and then by consensus we can include that as we move forward tonight. So I've made note of that, so thank you. I'm going to go back to the list. Or Trustee Olmsted, did you have a supplemental to that, or was that it?
No supplemental, just that the voices of SEAC strongly advocated for the trustees to speak on behalf of our special education needs. And so as a member, I felt it very important that that be voiced tonight to represent the members that sat around that table and expressed their deep concerns. And they also wanted the public to realize that the needs of our students has to be met, and we are desperately underfunded every single year. So they wanted that loud and clear at the public meeting this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Olmsted. That's noted. And like I said, we'll circle back around to this at the end of our meeting. So I will continue along in our questions then, and we'll go to Trustee Cook for the first set of questions before I go to the second round.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question and my concern is the exact same as Trustee Halberstadt and Trustee Olmsted, so I'm not going to take any more time. Feel the same way, and a consensus for a letter, and I understand what you just said about doing that later, so thank you.
Thank you, and so noted. And I will call for a first round of questions from trustees who are currently present. There's a number of trustees who want to go for a second round, just wanting to see if there's any first. Okay, seeing none. And I also just wanted to note that I don't see Trustee Sartori here still, so just wanted to make note of that. I'm going to go back to the second set of questions. So Trustee Hickison, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'm going to kind of echo a little bit of the last statements that have been made and about special education, and kind of narrow down a little bit. And my question is more around, it's kind of the middle ground between Trustee Halberstadt and then some of the information that we've heard through SEAC and through trustees as well about special education. And I was thinking about Lexia and Empower and how much what we've seen, the data that we've consistently seen shown in the use of those and our literacy and numeracy improvement for our students. And my question is kind of twofold. One, are we one of only a few boards who are using this, or are there other boards across? Are there more boards than us that are using it? Is it a large contingency of us that are using these these programs. And the reason I ask that is because it has traditionally come out of the director's contingency, and we have through some discussions that I've had with Director Kelly, we're kind of necessarily shifting a bit of our focus over in that contingency to equity, and equity doesn't disclude our special education learners. And so I'm wondering if we are a few boards who use these types of programs, and if in this letter that we are kind of drafting, whether there's things like supports for Lexia and Empower and other programs, intervention programs like that, that we could include as examples of ways that the ministry can support our work. In doing so, can we then shore up as much as we can in that director's contingency in the event that we are able to get that funded through the ministry in order to be able to shift a focus toward equity in the contingency fund? So maybe Director Kelly can help with that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a good question. And Superintendent Wilcox, you want to chime in. The original ways that we got money for some of the funding for Empower and Lexia was through a pilot project we're involved within the ministry. There was, I think, 3 or 4 boards involved in that. So they did initially assist with that. We wanted to go bigger, and so we contributed more to that. I think there are a lot of boards doing Empower. Maybe, I think we're one of the biggest Lexia users in the province, or maybe in the country even. So we were big on that. Could the ministry support us with those kinds of reading interventions? Absolutely, particularly with the ministry's focus on reading for the upcoming year. So maybe Superintendent Wilcox or Superintendent Howard want to add to that. But again, reading will be a focus for us for the upcoming year, and it needs to be with some of our students who haven't been in our schools for some time. Does anyone? Oh, there he is.
Sure. So I'm happy to speak to that, Director Kelly. So there's a big focus, a big partnership between the program department and special education. And we are working on a project this year to build the capacity of our teachers in terms of teaching to read based on the science of reading. So we're really excited about that project. It's very timely. In terms of Empower and Lexia, we have Empower in all of our elementary schools. We have piloted in secondary. Director Kelly is right, we were part of the reading intervention pilot that allowed us the money to train our learning support teachers, our LSTs, to deliver that program. We are the largest Lexia user in Canada. And in part, that is because we did utilize some of the funds from the Director's Contingency Fund last year to increase our number of licenses. We knew that some of our students would be pivoting this year and it might be back and forth, and we wanted to provide them as much support with building their reading as possible. So we felt that that was a very valuable investment. And if you are looking at drafting a letter around some of the needs in special education, I'm happy to provide you with some key speaking points if you would like.
I appreciate those answers very much. Oh, sorry, I'm interrupting you. Go ahead.
Make one clarification through you, Madam Chair. I know with respect to how the budget paid for Lexia came up, and I just wanted to add a bit to that. We did, I think a few years back, use a portion of the director's contingency to pay for a gap that existed in those costs. Over the last year or two, and Superintendent Wilcox can correct me, we've been creative in our ways to use funding or available pots of money to pay for Lexia. One of the pots has been the SIA reserve, which is very restricted as to what it can be used for. However, minister approval was available for us to use a good chunk of that to pay for Lexia. So if that continues, hopefully, which is good because we have a big reserve, then the director's contingency won't be needed for that specific cost, and we can maintain that through the reserve.
Thank you. I was just going to jump in to see if there's a supplemental there, Trustee Higginson.
Not really a supplemental. They were really they were answered very, very well, and I appreciate each of the perspectives of that. And I would like to make sure that gets added to the list of what we're sending in. I think it's very timely. I also wanted to just reiterate again that I wanted to say that I appreciate in the budget presentation us seeing the associations with our strategic priorities and our budget. I really appreciated seeing those things, so that when we hear things like from our stakeholders like SEAC and when we hear things from our other stakeholders, we can draw directly the connections between how we're spending money that they invest in public education and how we're spending it based on the strategic priorities that we've done. And I get concerned all the time, every time we talk about this budget, that we're just trading risk for risk, that the ministry is taking a risk on saying we can do a half years of COVID funding, and by the way, you can use your reserves, and we are saying that we've had these reserves in order to do things like bump up the director's contingency, to do things that really apply to our strategic priorities. And I would really like us to be quite strong in our letter to the ministry, that we have done the things that our students and our staff need, and they can answer that with the correct funding to be able to support those investments. So that is all that I have for my last question.
Thank you, and point noted. And I think that you're correct in saying administration gave us some good things to chew on in terms of that letter. So I've made notes, and yes, I think that's a great thing to add. So I'm going to continue down the list, and I will go to Trustee Burgess.
Thanks again, Madam Chair. I had a list here, and I was going to actually offer an amendment to do the letter, because that's usually how we do it. And but I'm happy with the consent. I also, just for noting, have as concerns the half-year COVID funding, that we need to talk about that, and that we would love to see our reserves reinstated. An acknowledgement that we have reserves. We've always had reserves for those rainy day funds, and COVID isn't the only rainy day that happens. So a bit of advocacy in there that this can't keep going on, that, we have those reserves for other reasons and not a global pandemic. And some of the shortcomings of enrollment pressures that we have, I think we have to, let the ministry know that the enrollment obviously has a huge effect on our budget. And we're not alone in that. And we would like more acknowledgement of how on an economy of scales, when you lose that much of enrollment, you can't deliver to the programs that you'd really like to deliver to as robustly as you want. I also take note of the age of, the 15 consecutive days taking folks off, taking enrollment off our registers. I think that's another thing we have to advocate for in this unusual year. In every other year, maybe that makes sense. It's certainly not. That's punitive. And I think we have to note that as well. You've talked about spec ed. I won't have to do that anymore in the Lexia. So my question is around the contingency fund for the equity advisor. I also have an additional question. I'll wait for round 3. But I heard the description of it. I recognize that we do have to bolster our staff just because of what's ahead of us and what we've encountered and what we're aware of. I know the director referred to a diversity officer. I think that title changed, I'm going to say 3 years ago. We have an equity and inclusion officer presently, and now we're looking to add an equity advisor. My concern is around how it's framed, in that it's addressing complaints and has a legal expertise. I was kind of looking more for a third-party arm's length advisory position, an ombudsman, that kind of thing, that would bolster the position that we presently have of the equity and inclusion officer. And I'm wondering, have we discussed, have you thought about anything like that? Obviously, there's a conflict of interest when we're paying for somebody to take over this position, but I hope it's not a reactive position. I would hope that it is indeed very proactive and would take care of, again, arm's length, have a stakeholder position, like an agreement that that this is truly fair, truly fair position, so that all of our stakeholders can have a heightened level of trust with this position. So I'm wondering if any of that is in the thought process, or are you definitely going to get something, that's kind of, complaint driven or legal only? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Measure. For a while, I've had a posting here. So there's lots of aspects of it and you raised them. So I really appreciate that. There are things in here like building and maintaining networks and supporting for human rights. I gave a very brief description before, but it's also consulting with staff, with parents, with students, with, with community. There's a lot of things in there that it's more than just the kind of complaint procedures, looking at policy. It's a very vast repertoire of skills that a person would need for this. So there's a whole list. I've looked at certainly other school boards and where they found value, where they've seen the work to be important. I've talked to a couple directors about this, where they have used this and have put together using some of their ideas as well, because where they saw value. But you are correct, it would be much broader than what I initially described, and it is called a Human Rights and Equity Officer, was the title that I've put on this, and you are correct in indicating the other role, which was originally diversity and now called equity and inclusion, but this would be more a Human Rights and Equity Officer is the present title that I have in draft here. But again, thank you for those points. All of those, I believe, would be included in the position.
So supplemental, if I could, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
One of the areas is, of course, overseeing equity within our staff, in our hiring practices, in all of those areas. And I look to the budget and I see that there are Indigenous academic instructors, additional, and federal money. Jordan's principle is, is allowing for more educational assistance, which is all great. Is there anything in the, we know how much money is there, we know the positions are there, and this is the budget, but is there any commitment to, even prior to getting the equity advisor, et cetera, to making sure that those positions who are serving our Indigenous families have a real deep understanding of Indigenous issues, or are themselves self-identified?
Trustee Burgess, I'm not sure what was your question. What was your final question there? Maybe I'm alone in that, but I didn't quite hear it.
There, in the recognition of, we know how much money there is in the actual hiring of it, of spending this budget, have we attached to the money that we're spending some sort of level of qualification or a request in the posting that some of these positions come from self-identified First Nations, Métis or Inuit, or that they have had undergone some level of professional development, et cetera, to understand, a fair approach to FNMI, not just an academic instructor, not just an educational assistant, that extra thing. Can we move that what do I want to say, dial forward?
Yes. Thank you, Trustee Burgess. And I apologize because I went off camera there for a bit because my internet went down. But I think what you were asking about, does this human rights position, one of the things I have in it is consulting on the implementation of school board hiring practices. But further to that, when we do hiring, I think what you were talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that what kind of checking to ensure that we're hiring people with the adequate training, knowledge, skills, maybe background in these areas. Is that what you were advocating for? And because I know that that's something that Superintendent Houston and I have talked about.
Yes, and specifically the Indigenous academic instructors and the education assistants, the additional ones that we have of because of our self-identification within our students to meet their needs.
Yes, thank you. And I don't know if Superintendent Howitt wants to comment on that, or Superintendent Houston, but I know that that is something we have talked about and needs to be highly considered, especially when we're working with students, our Indigenous students.
I can start off. Yes, our postings do include those to identify who are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. Some of those positions have been filled with Indigenous individuals. Some have not, but they are included in the postings. And as to the training, we do competency training. We're actually investigating another external group to assist with competency training for staff that work with Indigenous students. And we also do training for those individuals that are hired under Jordan's principle, whether if they're not Indigenous, so that they understand the history, culture, background as they engage with Indigenous students and families. So we do plan for both. Those postings do include the welcoming of people who self-identify for those positions, and we do provide training.
And I can just add one further thing. It's Superintendent Houston. For those that do self-identify as Indigenous, we do have a separate portal through Applied Education for our external applicants. For those that do self-identify Indigenous, apply directly through that portal, and their application comes through that process outside of our regular postings.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive answer. And I'll make note that on our board meeting after this, we do have a policy up that I'm sure that we can get into this a bit more, Trustee Burgess. So I just have one supplemental question actually to that I'll jump in for Director Kelly since we're on this issue. Do you, to Trustee Burgess's comment around this position being proactive rather than reactive, do you envision them undertaking any sort of work like an equity action plan and reporting to the board on a regular basis, rather than it just being complaint based or concern related?
Absolutely. Of course, that's one of the major things. You have to find out where the gaps are. And then, of course, you have to develop a plan to see how you can fill in those gaps. And this person would be, I think, essential to that. Yeah, there's many of those things within the draft posting that I have here that would be about developing that plan, working to ensure that it's put in place, and making sure that in all kinds of levels of policy. I mean, this would take some time, obviously, but it certainly is. Yeah, thank you for noting that.
Thank you for giving us a bit more detail there. And so I will continue on our list then and go to Trustee Cheen next for a second set of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is regarding that course NBE3C Indigenous Learning. I think it was mentioned, and it affected the budget. And I have a question. I heard from the students that this course is kind of mandatory. It kind of replaced the previous English language course, and that English language course previously teach a lot of grammars and a lot of language knowledge, but since they changed to the Indigenous learning course as an English course, it's kind of not the students, not the students' will to take this course, but there is no other language course to take. So I wonder if you can explain something regarding this course, and if a course affected the quality teaching of a language, and should we pay more attention on that, or we just let it go and satisfied with the increasing enrollment of this course and put the budget on this? Thank you.
Director Kelly, through you, Madam Chair, if I could. We see this course as a priority. I'm going to be very clear. This course is important in terms of understanding the history, and we have made a commitment as a board to do this. I do believe the teachers in the course are teaching, whatever the content, whether it's Indigenous novels or whatever we're teaching. It's always important for us to be very cognizant of the fact that we're teaching English literature too. We're teaching language, we're teaching skills, we're teaching essay writing, we're teaching these. As a former English teacher, I see that as a top priority, and all of those components are within that course. They have a different lens in terms of perspective, but those skills are all taught within those courses. And if anybody else wants to add to that, they certainly can. But I know Mr. Canty and I are both English teachers, and I don't think we would see a difference in those courses. It's just a different perspective. But it is a priority for us as a group of superintendents and the director. We feel very strongly about this.
If I can add to that, Director Kelly, through you, Madam Chair, I think it's a wonderful course. My wife actually teaches at Sandwich, and my daughters have taken it, and they've learned so much more in their high school careers than I learned until I was in university. I'm learning from them. Dr. Howard?
Yes, and it aligns perfectly with the principles of our Indigenous Education Protocol, which we signed as a community with our Indigenous leaders in 2016, which makes Indigenous education a priority in the district. And as Director Kelly mentioned, it meets the same criteria of the English course. It's done through an Indigenous literature lens. And the benefits that it's achieving within the district are evident within student learning, and I'm really proud to say that we're doing this as a district.
Thank you all for that comprehensive answer around that. I don't know if it was directly budget related, but I will jump in to say that I'll commend our board for continuing with this course. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, despite there being no ministry requirement to do so, and just our board seeing it as a priority in our system. And so again, I just want to reiterate the good work that's happening there as well. And I will go on to Trustee Halberstadt for a second set of questions there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, just a hit on something else that was in the budget on page 8. It says that that the province is looking for boards to limit their administration costs. So I don't know how that fits in with what we've been discussing, but anyway. But my main question has to do with actually on page 47. There's a health and safety expenses of $458,000 for school facilities, and I guess that brings up the issue of the VIREX report that we're waiting on. I'm just wondering when we might see that. Given the fact that when we go back to school, it'll be in September, and we're going to have to clean the schools. So I'm just wondering where we are with that report that the trustees asked for back a couple of months ago now.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Trustee Halberstadt, if I recall the motion that was passed, it was that administration consider the alternatives to VIREX and the associated costs, but there was no requirement or request that administration provide trustees with a report. Administration is looking at the alternatives that had been identified, and we are working with the Windsor-Essex County Health Unit. That work continues, but the health unit, to be fair, is pretty busy with vaccination clinics, and so we are continuing on that work as directed by trustees.
Okay, so we can assume that there'll be some kind of a decision before September, I'm hoping.
It will be dependent partly on our consultation with the health unit, and we have to be mindful of the fact that major changes in our custodial cleaning products, we currently have contracts with suppliers for a list of chemicals that we use in the board. The chemical management is coming up for RFP in the wintertime. So if there's any significant changes to those cleaning products, we would have to consider that in conjunction with an RFP that would occur later in the year.
Okay, well, I'll keep asking. Thank you.
Thank you. That was going to be my suggestion, Trustee Halberstadt. It can be something that is featured in our trustee question period as the fall gets underway. So I will go then to Trustee, actually, I will ask, are there any other second questions or first questions for those who haven't asked? And seeing none, I will then go to Trustee Burgess, and I'll permit one more set of questions, just so that we can tease out and make sure that we have all the information that we need for tonight's motion. So go ahead, Trustee Burgess.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The question is around the money that we're spending on facility upgrades and the choices that we're making. Last year, you remember, a year ago, we had barely consensus that COVID-19 was an airborne disease. Now we know, as emerging science comes, we realize that the biggest concern is not on the touch areas necessarily, but in the respiratory nature. So I know there's a lot of money going forward for doors hold open upgrades. And I can see that because, you know, high touch areas are a source of fomites, you know, the disease on the hands, and the hands can find the mucous membranes, etc. I can understand in certainly early years where, you know, everything goes in your mouth or whatever you touch, you know, eventually those things end up in little kids' circulation. So I understand where cleaning surfaces is important, but we understand now that that's really not where the big, huge spread is. It's in ventilation. And I know we've made some very careful decisions around ventilation upgrades. I'm concerned by, in the budget presentation, that we're holding these higher standards of, you know, higher filters, higher MERV, you know, filters, and greater air exchange, etc., being more expensive because it's more expensive to run. I think of them as the new standard. And it bothers me that I think that there might be temporary, because maybe when, you know, the big rubber stamp comes and says, oh, the pandemic's over, we'll lower our ventilation standards, as well as, you know, maybe the surface cleaning to a pre-pandemic level. The doors hold open are something that will always be there. It'll always be something where we can prevent transmission within our buildings of all kinds of things that are spread by touch. But if we kind of cheap out on all the ventilation stuff, that's a legacy I don't really want to see going forward. And specifically when we're still in an active pandemic, even though we feel it's diminishing with new variants, blah, blah, blah. Can you give me some of the logic that was made in this budget so that we put that much money on touch, like doors open, and not spend the real bulk of it on ventilation?
Okay, thank you for the question through you, Madam Chair. You do raise some very good, you've made some great comments. I think the guidance that we seem to be hearing about more and more really does speak to the importance of ventilations in schools to address the concerns with respect to COVID-19 and transmission. The comments, right now the board is committed to using MERV 13 filters. That's part of the ASHRAE standards that the board has implemented, and we would continue to implement that. Of course, we continue to always follow the guidelines from the Ministry of Education with respect to the health and safety protocols that they put in place for the schools. We don't know what those will be for September because we don't have that information yet. But MERV 13 filters is something that we are committed to doing. You've spoken about the Door Hold Open project. That's part of our resilience infrastructure funding, and that is absolutely a great initiative that does reduce high touch surfaces. But also part of that funding that we are receiving from the Resilience Infrastructure Fund, the bulk of it is related to mechanical ventilation in our schools. And what that entails is for our schools that were not slated to have any type of mechanical ventilation equipment installed, we're now able to do that. So, and where we had schools where the equipment needed to be replaced in order to improve its efficiency and its operating effectiveness, that funding does allow us to do that. So really, through that funding, basically all of our school spaces are going to have mechanical ventilation in them. There are a few places where there's some limitations with that funding, where if schools are scheduled to close within 5 years, so we'll see that with, for example, DM Eagle, Kingsville District High School, Jack Minor, Kingsville Public, General Amherst, those schools aren't eligible for CVRIS funding. That's the Resilience Infrastructure funding, but we continue to make sure that those spaces have the HEPA air filters to try and improve the ventilation and the cleanliness of the schools with respect to that. As well, we've also assessed our portables. All of our portables also do have unit ventilation in place, with the exception of 5 portables. And again, in those, we've put HEPA air filters in place for those as well. We are intending to run our ventilation systems like we did this current school year. So it runs 2 hours in the morning before school starts and 2 hours at the end of the day. It does promote what we call building flushing. So it helps to keep that air and to keep the circulation and those elements of it much more healthier for our students. And that is directly from the ASHRAE standards that we have implemented. It is a budget risk because it is costly to do those elements of it. And if you look on the budget slides in terms of the funding that we are getting from the ministry of $483,000 for building supports, of which only like $224,000 we can budget right now, that's just a drop in the bucket for the cost of what we would need to do these initiatives. But you know, it is clearly the resilience infrastructure funding really does help with the mechanical ventilation improvements that we are going to see in the schools. And I'm pleased to report that while those projects need to be completed right now by December 31st, we're actually on target to complete those projects by October 31st. So our students and our staff are going to benefit from that improved mechanical ventilation in the schools much earlier.
Thank you for that, Superintendent Armstrong. Trustee Burgess, was there a follow-up to that?
Sort of yes and no. I appreciate that, and I certainly support this budget with the amendment to draw the letter to the attention of the ministry. But I would like perhaps in that letter some advocacy, a recognition that we still would like to have better ventilation as an ongoing. It's what it's done is it's made apparent that indoor air quality really has a huge impact on enrollment and engagement. So even if there isn't COVID-19, reduction of flu and cold system, flus and colds in our buildings. If you think about the occasional teacher costs and absenteeism, et cetera, let alone kids being present in school and missing things. So it's an investment that does translate into other costs in other areas. So if we could acknowledge that special one-time resiliency funding, et cetera, but advocate for it to continue, because ventilation in all school properties across the province need to improve. We need to raise the standard. Thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Burgess. I've made note of that for our letter as well. So I will ask trustees one more time if there are any further questions for the queue for a final set of questions. Okay, seeing none, I have one or two, and one of them is actually a question I've asked previously at previous meetings, and I just wanted administration to clarify this again, and also relate it to the conversation around online or remote learning. So on page 29 of our budget binder, which was also referenced in the PowerPoint today, it was discussed how the ministry is changing their funding methodology for classroom teacher staffing for within the online section by by basically saying that the 2 course credits that secondary students have to take, those are essentially class size averages for the purposes of funding are being increased to 30 to 1 as opposed to our normal class size averages. And as a result, we are seeing a decrease in funding. I think earlier on in our when we've seen this being presented to our board, there was no number attached to it. But now we're seeing that number is approximately 200,000, if I'm reading it correctly on page 19. Sorry, I might have said 29 earlier. I'm just wondering if that, my question comes to the detail around that that budget item, in that it's coming out of our pupil foundation grant and not coming out of our enrollment budget. Is administration able to speak to why it's coming from a different funding source than enrollment, and how the ministry can justify the lack of funding for a change in class size average when we have collective agreements that we need to uphold in our own board and results in a shortfall to us? I'm wondering if there's any sort of commentary there.
This is Superintendent Armstrong. Through you, Madam Chair, I'm wondering if Mr. Mayhew would like to try this question.
I would love to try this question. Thank you.
Sorry, that sounded goofy that way.
No,
Go ahead, give it a try.
Yeah, it's a good question. And Superintendent Housing could correct me if I'm wrong. However, I believe the move to online learning is embedded in the collective agreements, and the class sizes for online learning of 30 to 1 is also in the collective agreements. And the reason why that flows through the Pupil Foundation grant is because that's where we get our funding for teachers specifically. So essentially, with the higher class size, what that results in overall throughout the entire system, you would require essentially less teachers for that online learning because of the higher class size compared to the regular, I believe, 23 to 1. So as a result, the benchmarks themselves in the Pupil Foundation allocation are decreased slightly, and then they flow through the total enrollment calculation such that we're actually funded for less teachers in the Pupil Foundation allocation as a result of the new online learning requirement. Not sure if that answers it.
Yes, it does. Yes. And I'm just trying to understand then. So this does not relate in essence to our remote learning option that was identified anyway. This is to do with students who are enrolled and have to take 2 online courses as part of our e-learning. Okay, so then my supplemental to that is, and relatedly, this is the gap I was trying to bridge here. There's no mention of any different cost structures with a remote learning option that our board is tasked with providing. Is that something that will come at revised estimates, or are we just funding that at the same essentially class size average as a normal in-person school?
How about I try this one? Through you, Madam Chair. The budget reflects expenses that equal the COVID funding supports that the board is getting. We acknowledge that we have announced or shared information on learning models. It's challenging to associate costs with those because the parent model, the parent survey for parents to make a decision on whether their children will opt out of in-person learning. We don't have the results of that yet to know the number of students that may be participating in a remote learning option, which then informs the associated costs. So to the extent that we have funding supports, we've matched the expenses to that. And we do acknowledge that when we get to revised estimates, that we may need to make some adjustments to our budget and to the related expenses to accommodate the costs that we're better able to project based on that information. I don't know if I answered that question.
I think so. Mostly, I think what I was getting at was that our remote option is not going to be funded differently than, in essence, the way that we would fund students who are in an in-person class. In essence, if we, have, as we are doing hybrid at the secondary level, so we have put forward so far, we don't know those numbers yet, but it wouldn't result in massive classes because these are two essentially separate ways of funding our online learning. One is through the e-learning and then one is through a remote learning option. But I just wanted to make that distinction that's clear because I didn't see that in the budget in terms of cost structure for our remote learning option.
I can just add one comment to that. I think the funding that we get for COVID specifically, which is supposed to capture some of the costs associated with remote learning, isn't necessarily explained in terms of how it's allocated for what specific staff, what portion is designated to teaching, etc. That said, in a remote learning environment, I still believe, and again, administration can help me out here, that we're still bound by class size requirements as determined by the collective agreements and as determined by the model that exists. So I would think moving forward, I'm not aware of any other guidance that would say remote learning has to be done at a different class size than what's stipulated in the grant formula and in the collective agreements. So we would just continue that online learning model as if the students were in class, and class sizes inherently might reduce as a result, depending on the mix of children within those classrooms, those remote classrooms. As Superintendent Armstrong mentioned, we're not aware of the total of all the students right now that have selected that option. So it's tough, I think, for administration to determine the exact model and how that impacts teaching allocation, staffing, and how that effectively impacts class size average throughout the system, which would then determine, I guess, total teacher allocations and section allocations, etc.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I just wanted to make that distinction clear that it wasn't going to be it wouldn't fall under the same category as our e-learning that we are seeing on page 19 there, but that it was within the normal class size averages, and that there wasn't any sort of funding shortages or anything there that we were looking at today. So thank you for that clarification. And I think with that, I just want to, I guess, just offer any other trustees the opportunity to ask a question before I call the question. Superintendent Armstrong, did you want to add anything there? No? Okay. So I'm gonna read the recommendation out just so that it is clear that that the board approve an operating budget of $482,054,081 for the fiscal period September 1st, 2021 to August 31st, 2022, resulting in a deficit for compliance purposes of the Ministry of Education compliance calculation of $4,272,908, and that the board approve a capital budget of $83,977,275 for the fiscal year period September 1st, 2021 to August 31st, 2022. It's already been moved and seconded. Can I ask for support via the chat from trustees? Thank you. Support by Trustee Leclerc, Trustee Higginson, Trustee Olmsted, Trustee Cheatham, Trustee Cook. And I think that would be it, actually. Myself, yeah, I'm just making the count, and Trustee Halberstadt there. And then Trustee Burgess makes note of support with recognition of the letter by consensus. And yes, I didn't note that. I was going to make a quick note after it carries, so the motion does carry. Say that I have made a list of issues that trustees have identified tonight that I will pass along to our chair and our executive assistant to make sure that those are included, and then we can ask for an update about that as well. Again, I just want to extend deepest appreciation and gratitude to Superintendent Armstrong and Mr. Mayhew. I know that you've given this presentation to trustees several times this year, which is actually very nice because I think this meeting prepared us, all that information in advance prepared us accordingly. Whereas I know last year it felt like sometimes we were building the plane as we were flying it. So as we said, so I appreciate that, and we look forward to the work on this and at revised estimates. I'm sure asking more questions and learning more about that extra 1%. So thank you, and I will then convene now into our special public board meeting, and so I will turn it over to Chair Higgison. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. All right, so I will call our special public board meeting to order at 7:20 p.m. And for attendance tonight for this portion of the meeting, Trustee Hatfield sends her regrets. Student Trustee Unger also sends her regrets. We wish her congratulations. She is graduating tonight, which is why she's not joining us. So congratulations to her. And Trustee Sartori will be a little bit late this evening. I see she wasn't able to make it to our budget meeting, but she hopes to make it to this portion. She may be a little bit late. So I'm looking for approval of the agenda. I see it's moved by Trustee Cook. Do I have a seconder? Seconded by Trustee Olmsted. Appreciated. Any discussion on the agenda, trustees?
Madam Chair, oh, sorry.
Trustee Burgess?
What revisions are on the special meeting? What has been struck from the previous? Honestly, I thought this was just a continuation of the session.
We have a special board. We were sent by Madame Leboeuf a special board meeting public session agenda.
Thank you.
That's where I'm at right now. Trustee Sipcar, did you have the same question? Yeah, okay. So we have a special board meeting agenda. It is also posted on the website for anyone frantically looking for it right now. It's out there. So we have it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion on the public session agenda that we have this evening? For a reminder for anybody watching and for all trustees, this is the continuation of the motions that we shifted from last meeting to have this meeting tonight. So it's just the motions that were, or the agenda items that were moved from last session. Any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none. Anyone opposed to the agenda tonight? Seeing no opposition, that passes. Thank you, trustees. Any declarations of conflict of interest for in here this evening? All right, so we're on to E1, new business. The first one is we're going to revisit what we just passed. So we're looking for a recommendation on approval of the budget. I see it's been moved by Trustee Cook and seconded by Trustee Sipcar. I would ask for discussion, but we just had about 2.5 hours of it. So anyone opposed to the support of the budget and the consensus on the letter being sent? Seeing no opposition, that passes. Thank you, trustees, and thank you again to administration, to all our stakeholders who provided some feedback to us as well. We're on to E2. We have a regular policy and regulation in front of us on teacher hiring practices. Do I have a mover? Moved by Trustee Cook, seconded. Seconded by Trustee Sipcar. Thank you very much. Any discussion, trustees? Is there any presentation by administration on this? It is a brand new policy and regulation. Do we have any discussion, any questions? Trustee or Superintendent Houston, do you have anything you'd like to present on this one?
Sure.
Wonderful.
I'd be happy to. So through you, Madam Chair, I wanted to give a little bit of a background because of the Regulation 274 being revoked. And during Policy Committee, I think the background was a little bit helpful for the committee to be able to have an understanding of where the policies come from. So in November of 2020, Regulation 274 was revoked. That regulation had actually come into effect in 2012, and that governed teacher hiring within the province of Ontario. After the revocation of the reg, the Ministry of Education put in place an interim hiring policy, which was followed by the Program Policy Memorandum 165 in 2021 in February. Following the implementation of the PPM, all school boards in Ontario needed to create their own teacher hiring practices policy. Several boards worked together with support from OPSPA as well to create their own board hiring policies. So a little bit of background history. Some of the concerns previously with Reg 274 was, for example, if there was a teacher in Ontario who was a contract teacher who wanted to move to a different board, there was no option for mobility. They would need to start over, basically. ETFO had a little bit of a difference, but they would need to become a day-to-day teacher again before they could become long-term and contract. So some challenges with mobility. As well, the policy previously, the regulation was governed on seniority. So top 5 eligible people were the only people who would be eligible for interviews for long-term placements or for teaching contracts. So there was no room for those. Potentially it had been part of a school community. If somebody had done several long terms in one school, they may not be eligible to be able to become a contract teacher within that same school. And it somewhat lacked the ability to diversify our teaching staff based on our schools because it was 100% seniority based. So we have shared the PPM as well as our draft policy with our Indigenous Education Advisory Council, as well as with Family Fuse. We have consulted with all of our teacher union presidents and with our principal association, senior administration, and then brought it forward to our policy committee. So basically the policy, we're committed to having a diverse and a qualified teaching workforce to support our students in our community. We are obligated under the Ontario Human Rights Code for equitable hiring practices. And this is going to help to guide us because it will guide all of the work that needs to be done for us in moving forward in our teaching hiring. Following approval of the policy, there's a substantial amount of administrative work that needs to be done, and the PPM outlines very specifically what effective practices will look like. For example, is declaration of conflict of interest, anti-bias training for any panel member, our postings, which was asked about earlier in our applied education process, interview training on human rights and anti-racism, our workforce census data to be able to identify gaps. And so we're in the process of implementing that right now, and then developing matrices for our questions, for our criteria, for our ranking, and for our feedback. And this also, within our policy, allows for hiring based on merit and based on lived experiences, and takes away that it must be seniority based. The policy also provides an opportunity for the board, capital B board, to monitor and to evaluate annually the process of our hiring practices, but it still maintains the importance of our teacher qualifications, and our staffing process is quite detailed, particularly in our secondary schools, and we pride ourselves on our teachers being qualified to teach in the subjects, but it does open it up for us to be able to have better representation of our students seeing themselves and their teachers in their classrooms. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. I do see a question from Trustee Sipkar and another from Trustee Halberstadt. Go ahead, Trustee Sipkar.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair, to Superintendent Houston. You touched on it right at the end. I just wanted to get clarification on Section 9, which is the monitoring and evaluation, which is on page 4 of 5. I know we had a discussion at the policy committee level, and I think you said it basically by saying capital B board. I just wanted to ensure that 9.2 refers to that the information that we collect and analyze as a means of evaluating this our hiring practices, that the plan with that information is to report it to the Board of Trustees on a semi-regular basis, I'm assuming annual, which isn't captured. Is that the intention of that of 9.2?
Correct, and thank you, through you, Madam Chair, to Trustee Sipkar's question. That was asked in policy committee specifically, and yes, I believe that both the director and myself indicated that we would be happy to potentially at an operations meeting bring forward on an annual or at the request of the trustees any updates in terms of monitoring the performance of our new hiring policy.
Thank you. And as a supplemental to that, and I actually am very happy with this policy, and I know we had good discussion at our policy committee around it, and particularly this one with a lot of the conversations around equity inclusion work. I think monitoring and evaluating is very important. I'm wondering if we want to consider adding something to the end that says on an annual basis, as a means of just putting a finer point on the expectation that trustees do want to be kept abreast of this information on a regular basis, not just by request. And so I look to support by friendly amendment from my colleagues to just maybe add at the end on an annual basis.
So is that an amendment on the floor, Trustee Sipkar?
Sure, yeah, I'll put that on the floor. Yeah.
So, so the amendment on the floor then is at 9.2, trustees. That would be the board will collect and analyze data, example, collection of voluntary demographic information from the board's current workforce, as well as from candidates within the hiring process as a means of evaluating and monitoring the effectiveness of its hiring practices, and will report on an annual basis to trustees. Is that correct, Trustee Sipkar?
Yes, thank you.
Does that amendment have a seconder?
Yeah,
Wonderful.
I'll second it. It's Trustee Sartori. Thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Sartori, and welcome. So that's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on that amendment, trustees?
Discussion that I had it in the chat to support, just to let you know.
Thank you. All right, anyone opposed to that amendment? Much appreciated for that amendment. That passes. Any other discussion? Trustee Halberstadt, and then I have Trustee Burgess next. Go ahead, Trustee Halberstadt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'm just wondering when we talk about gaps there on during the dialogue, does that have anything to do with percentages of, I guess, visible minorities, reflecting more the overall population of the I guess of the school board staff, and if that's it, have we collected that data yet, or we're in the process of getting it, and that would be part of the report every year that Trustee Sipkar referenced.
Thank you for the question, Trustee Halberstadt, through you, Madam Chair. That's an excellent question. That is exactly what we've been working on recently, is to, we've gone to our union partners about what questions would we ask on our workforce census, because that is one of the requirements of the PPM. And so we're just in the process of setting all of that up to be able, we're going to start in July with all of our non-teaching staff to complete the survey, and they do identify several demographic data information, particularly to some of the things that you've referenced on underrepresentation. And then in September, when our teaching staff and our support staff return to schools, they'll participate in this, taking the survey, which will then create reports for us to specifically be able to identify X number of individuals in certain job classes and where are our gaps, because at the same time, we'll be implementing a student survey on demographic data for self-identification, and then we'll be able to compare those two survey results to be able to know, are we underrepresented or overrepresented in students or in staff, to be able to purposefully work towards hiring staff that represent those specific areas. But we don't know what it is yet until we do the actual surveys.
Okay, just a supplementary. So I take it that all of this, as the data is accumulated, would be public information?
Yes, it would be. And that would be part of what we would report to the trustees. The first part actually would be our data gathering and what we found from our data and what our next steps would be.
Good, thank you.
Felicia, you're up.
I think she might be frozen. Trustee Egerson, I think you are frozen. Trustee Cook, I don't know if you want to jump in maybe.
Well, I think she's back.
Okay, I'm still seeing her as frozen.
Wow, that was fun. It glitched for me right out. Sorry about that, everyone. I'm back. Surprise, in and out. Thank you, Superintendent Houston, for that answer. Trustee Burgess, I believe you're next on the list for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You are still visually frozen, although I can hear you, so I don't know what's up, but it's a good segue from the previous question. And I am in support of this policy, teacher hiring practices, but I do recognize that it just only speaks to OCT members, and that the discussion that we just had is about non-teaching staff. So I want to say I'm in support of this, and I don't have any questions per se that haven't been unanswered, that have gone unanswered between policy committee and the discussion today. Do we anticipate a policy for hiring practices for non-OCT for the rest of the staff? I understand the practice, I understand the goal, I understand the action, the survey, etc., but we don't have a policy.
Thank you, Trustee Burgess. Through you, Madam Chair, that is definitely our goal, in hopes of approval of the teacher hiring practice and to start to implement that. And our next goal would be to have an overall Greater Essex County District School Board hiring policy for all staff.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Just so supplemental, because I know you said you had conversations with ETFO, OSSTF, and of course they OSSTF, I mean, particularly represents non-college teacher staff in addition. So I appreciate that response. Thanks.
Thank you very much, trustees. Any further questions on this amended policy? I'm going to call the question on the recommendation in front of us to approve this policy and regulation this evening. Anyone opposed? Hearing no opposition, that passes. Thank you very much. We're on to E3, policy and regulation on an education and community partnership program. I see it's been moved by Trustee Cook. Any seconder for E3?
Second.
Thank you, Trustee Halberstadt. That's been seconded. Any discussion on the policy and regulation on education and community partnership program? Any discussion, trustees? Seeing none, I will call the question. Anyone opposed to the policy and regulation on education and community partnership program E3 in our agenda this evening? Anyone opposed? Anyone opposed? Seeing and hearing none, that passes. Thank you very much, trustees. Chugging right along here to E4. We have a regulation in front of us for gender identity and expression student records. I'm looking for a mover and a seconder on E4. Moved by Trustee Cook, seconded by Trustee Sipcar. Thank you very much. Any discussion on gender identity and expression student records? Any discussion?
Madam Chair?
Indeed, Trustee Burgess, go ahead.
The discussion, well, it's just a commendation if I could. I know there was a lot of work put into this, like every policy that comes forward, but prior to it coming forward to policy committee, I just want to, if you can please thank everybody who had volunteer hours beyond measure within our staff, particularly the GSA for Staff committee, who worked really hard on the wordsmithing for many meetings over this. So I just want to recognize that it looks like, just a couple of lines on a piece of paper to move this motion, but it had many volunteer hours behind it. Thanks.
Certainly and absolutely. Those two little lines are moved by much more than just us. So I thank you very much for that recognition. Any further discussion on E4? Seeing and hearing none, I will call the question on E4, our regulation on gender identity and expression student records. Any opposition to this regulation, trustees? Anyone in opposition to the regulation? Seeing and hearing none, that passes. Wonderful, wonderful. We are on to E5, a notice of motion by Trustee Chin. Trustee Chin, would you like to move this motion?
Oh, yes, yes.
Thank you. Do we have any seconders for the recommendation in front of us?
I'll second it for discussion purposes.
Seconded by Trustee Halberstadt. Any discussion? Trustee Chin, would you like to comment?
Oh, can I read this motion?
I can read the motion, but what we I'm just wondering, as the mover, if you have any discussion you'd like to offer.
Yeah, could you read this first, and then I make discussion.
Certainly can. So the recommendation in front of us is, considering the coming hot weather and back to school plan that most of the students have to wear masks at school, in order to pursue equity and better quality of education and safety and health of students, I move that an ad hoc committee be established to research on the necessity of an air conditioning improvement strategy across the board, the possibility of different air conditioning supplements, including more cooling centers, portable air conditioners, and wall-mounted air conditioner fans, etc. Also set up a communication plan with communities and fundraising plan, etc. The committee consists of 2 or 3 trustees, senior administrators, experts, teachers, parents, and student representatives. So that's what's on the floor currently.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. And yeah, I made this motion because I think during current pandemic and the hot weather, I think it's very important because the students have to wear masks in school. And I think it concerns with the safety and healthy issue. And also, and based on our mission and student wellness and well-being is the center of our school board strategy. And so I think this air conditioner has already, impact the student studying environment a lot. And I do have a lot of complaint from that students and parents regarding that. So I know that it's kind of a budget issue, but we have to, try to have do our best to solve the issue. And if we don't have money currently, we may have a plan, long-term plan to solve it instead of just leave it unsolved. And second is that that we did the survey for the budget, and the ventilation and cleaning has been the second. And I am not sure if to my understanding, the air conditioning issue is also included, related to the ventilation, and the third is that. And I think it has affected the, equity and discrimination issue. Of course, I heard the parents, because I'm in the area in Massey School, I heard many parents complained that there are a lot of immigration in this area, so this school has been ignored, and the air conditioning and the school condition and it's kind of low, improved, less than other school. So I think since our anti-discrimination, avoid discrimination is also our one of important purpose, and I I don't think that we, discriminate the old big school is fair for the students and for the board. So I think it has issued. It has been come out a lot of issue, and it's good for us to have a committee to discuss this issue and consult with the parents and students to have their voice opinions and try to solve the problem. Otherwise, I believe after 5-10 years, it's still like this. It's not appropriate way, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have some follow-up questions and comments. Trustee Sipcar, go ahead. Trustee Sartori, you're on deck. Go ahead, Trustee Sipcar.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I just want to comment to say that I thought about this motion, and I actually will be supporting it. And the reason being, and I was debating it because this issue has come up several times. I mean, in the last 3 years, but even prior to that, I know past boards have dealt with it, and it is a consistent issue. And the last time that this came up, it was via a policy, and we looked at it at the policy committee level of what could be done. And I think Trustee Cheen raises a number of issues. I caution, and I don't like that it is any one school in particular. I think what I would like to do is look at it at a system level way, which I think the motion actually does capture. And I think having more dedicated time to discuss this issue and to see if there are any possible solutions that can be achieved within our board, I think would be wise. I think we're not in a position right now where we need to worry about it as our students are not in school, but I think it can be something that we work on over the next year or so and see if there is any opportunity to improve in any way for all schools, really. So I will be supporting the motion on that basis.
Thank you. Go ahead, Trustee Sartori.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question of administration, if I might, about what and if any, impact on the updates to the HVAC systems that we're doing in, my understanding is quite extensively across the board, but I am definitely no expert in this area. And so I'm wondering if there are, new air conditioning units going in already, and in how many schools, if you have that information tonight, and as well as what the impact of a new HVAC system might have on the sort of classroom environment anyway. When I think about new HVAC systems, I think about new efficiencies and better climate control, but I'm not sure how AC ties into all that.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, Superintendent Armstrong. I have with us this evening Julianne Hinchliffe, who is our Manager of Facility Services, and Vince Laframboise, we're very fortunate to have a Building Systems Officer. He is intimately involved with our building systems and with the mechanical ventilation in our schools and the issue of air conditioning. It's not a simple solution just to say that we can implement this. It's far beyond a budget issue, and I'd like to welcome both Julie and Vince to speak to your questions in further detail.
Through you, Madam Chair, I will definitely let Mr. Laframboise speak on Facility Services' behalf.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So through you, Madam Chair, this is of course much more complicated than the simple term of air conditioning. So in my world, when I hear the word air conditioning, I hear how do we condition the air, and yet I know the popular term for air conditioning is just cooling. So to deal with Trustee Sartori's question, in terms of I'll start with what we're doing, and then I'm going to talk about why we've made the decisions that we've made under the current funding envelope that we had, and how it kind of fits with our existing structure of buildings without, sacrificing the buildings themselves. So currently under the CVRIS funding stream, as it's already been reported. We were able to secure the funds to add ventilation to all of our schools that we're going to have that are not slated for replacement, which is very exciting. One of the ways that we looked at to do it, that these buildings are already heated. So when we had to look at, what are we going to do for these systems, understanding that it's scarce tax dollars, but needing to add ventilation where heating already existed. We looked at an approach of adding energy recovery units to extract the heat that we've already put into the space, reheat the outside air, and then deliver that air to capture as much energy that we've already put into the air. The challenge is that there is no energy recovery that's 100%. So we knew that to do that in the winter, you're going to have to heat that air up. And when we're challenged with reducing greenhouse gases, adding it to our existing boiler systems would have necessitated a total review of our heating plants. So we went down the road of, well, what other options exist? One of them that existed was an air source heat pump, which if people have talked about, there's some areas in the city that don't have gas that needed to get off electric baseboard. They went to air source heat pumps just because they're so much more efficient than electric heating. So we looked at the same approach, and then we were also struggling with, well, then what do you do in the summer? And I think everyone in Windsor knows it gets pretty humid in the summer. I have a lot of trouble with my hair in the summer because it's so humid. And we knew that we couldn't just capture the air that's in the building and kind of transfer it to the incoming air without conditioning it somehow. So the idea of an air source heat pump allows us to both heat the air in the winter, and by adding something very small, we're also allowed to help condition that air in the summer. And really what we're trying to do there is we're trying to remove the moisture content of the air. And so when I hear the term air conditioning, my training and experience brings me back to, okay, how do we condition the air? Because there's many parts to conditioning the air. There's heating the air and cooling the air, which we all know is pretty straightforward. But when you get into the psychrometrics of it, of where are we comfortable, there's a lot more that goes into it in terms of controlling moisture. So in a very broad term, I hope I answered the question in terms of what we're doing this summer with the CVRIS funding, which is we're adding ventilation to 14 schools. And those are the schools that we're going to have for longer than 5 years, which was one of the stipulations. And we're also, as we're bringing in this outdoor air, we're going to condition the air both in the winter so that we're not bringing in cold air, but it's neutral because we can already heat the buildings. And in the summer, we're trying to knock that moisture content down, which we're really hoping adds, improves the comfort feeling inside those buildings. As part of the CVRIS funding too, we were able to add cooling centers under our policy. So libraries, cafeterias, gymnasiums. Actually, I'm not sure if gyms are in there, but certainly libraries, cafeterias, and offices where we've added cooling centers in. So we've really gone after kind of the biggest bang for our buck, I guess is the best way to look at it. To take it a step further in terms of to just look at cooling. So one of the issues, we're adding ventilation to 14 schools this year. 3 of those schools we had to do an electrical upgrade on. And that's the reality of adding more equipment to our buildings. So the idea of if we only were adding cooling into these buildings, they would have been much larger electrical upgrades, which is kind, sometimes troublesome in some of these old schools. So there's more than just adding cooling. One of the other really big components, and I touched on it already, is this idea of moisture control. So one of the hardest parts of introducing cooling into a building is actually the moisture control in terms of what it does to the rest of the building. One of the biggest challenges is a lot of these buildings don't have a vapor barrier. So, today when we build houses, and I'm going to use houses as an analogy because they're pretty simple. If you see a house being constructed, it's pretty much wrapped in plastic. And part of the building code that addressed that is they have to put in HRVs now to bring in outside air because they had found that they were building too tight. And what that does is it creates a vapor barrier over the building, so you can actually change the moisture content within the building. Our old schools don't have that. So while they may have a lot of insulation and questionable about whether it would be enough or not, one of the biggest struggles that we have there is actually our moisture control. So without a vapor barrier, this moisture can travel freely through walls if we're not careful. And when you have moisture in a building, you can have a lot of other issues, including molding, including structural damage to the actual structure of the building. So it's a really, to add cooling is a complicated thing. And then when we talk about air conditioning is really all of the things that we do to the air. So energy recovery, heating, and cooling. And I think there's an important distinction to be made there, so that we're kind of doing the best that we can. Certainly with our new projects that we did this year, it's that approach of we have to condition that air, and doing it in the most responsible way possible. I hope that answers the question from Trustee Sartori.
Thank you. Supplemental, if I may, Madam Chair, thank you. So if I'm understanding correctly, then there would be a like a literal conditioning of the air happening as a result of the new updates with the ventilation systems in 14 schools that should have a discernible impact on the comfort level inside the classrooms without it necessarily being an air conditioning unit. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, that's essentially what we're doing. Although the equipment may look like cooling equipment, it's really only designed to remove the moisture content out of the air in the summer. And you know, we're trusting that bringing in that outside air and knocking down the moisture content will make the building more comfortable. Because the challenge is, of course, ventilation is the priority, right? And to do that properly, this is what we needed to do.
Madam Chair, can I please have one more supplemental? Okay, it's a two-parter. So would there be a felt change then to the temperature in the air, or is the idea that if the humidity is reduced, which is I think what I'm hearing, that should have a sort of a noticeable difference anyway. Does that make sense? Like, so saying that it doesn't necessarily have to be the temperature in the air, or like, would the temperature in the air be impacted by these changes, or only the level of humidity?
Mr. Laframboise, are you frozen? I think.
I don't know if Ms. Hinchliff might be able to try and answer that question, or we'll have to wait for Mr. Laframboise to.
He's back.
I can hear you. Sorry, I just turned off my camera there briefly. Hopefully that helps my my internet connection. So I'll try to not be overly technical when I answer this. And you'll have to excuse me. I do, I live in a pretty technical world. So the concept of humidity and moisture control within a building is really about that user comfort. So I can actually, in my past, I could cool a building down to 70 degrees and people would be uncomfortable. Because if I can't remove the moisture content out of the air, the way our bodies react to that is our skin's constantly evaporating. And if our skin can't evaporate moisture out, our own body is unable to kind of cool itself, right? So really the concept is to get drier air helps us feel more comfortable. So as much as, temperature is the thing that we can feel, we can't, as humans, we just can't feel humidity. So when we walk into a space and we could say it feels hot, sometimes the temperature is good, but the moisture content is really high. So our body adapts to that and tells us kind of how we feel. The goal with the work that we're doing, although it may, I do expect it to bring down the measurable temperature and kind of that temperature that we think that we feel, we do expect it to very much reduce the amount of moisture in the air, which will help make the buildings more comfortable. And really the goal there is to actually improve user comfort while providing ventilation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Cook, I have you next in line. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So first of all, I want to commend Trustee Chin on her perseverance on this. She's brought this up quite a few times, so got to commend her on that. I do have a problem with the motion, though. When you read the motion, it's an ad hoc committee, which is usually 3 to 4 meetings. And I can tell you that this issue, just by Mr. Laframboise's response, is a very complex issue, and 3 to 4, meetings is not going to do it. But there's so many people on this committee, that Trustee Chin wants on the committee, and there's so many issues. Like some of the issues in here are window air conditioners and other cooling stations, which we have addressed before. And I do agree with Trustee Sipkar on it has to be like across the board in terms of, all schools, not just one school. If there was an amendment to the motion, if Trustee Chin kind of closed it up and made it a little bit more specific, then I would consider supporting it. But when it's like this, I can't support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Cook. Trustee Leclerc, I've got you next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I assume you can hear me.
I can, yes.
Thank you. So I'm not going to support the motion. I think there's a number of items here. One is the recommendation from Trustee Chin is that we strike an ad hoc committee. And when I look at the ad hoc committee, most of the people that are suggested to be on it are not experts. They're not engineers. And we have an expert on staff. We have experts on staff who continually address this issue. I don't know how a trustee could contribute to making decisions based on even the slightest of what Mr. Laframboise just spoke about. Secondly, we do have a very extremely old facility inventory, and we are slowly pecking away at that. We have lots of schools that are considerably older than the one that Trustee Chin is specifically referring to, that don't have air conditioning. And I think what we need to understand is our administration is slowly pecking away at those issues. We just heard 14 schools this summer are being addressed, if I heard that correctly. And I guess finally, Madam Chair, I'm disappointed that Trustee Chin is putting forth in her argument for this committee that somehow administration is discriminatory. I'm offended by that. I think our administration should be concerned by that comment, because I don't believe for a second that our administration is making decisions on anything other than expert opinion and their judgment based on facility conditions. It has nothing to do with discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Leclerc, and I will note that that there have been comments made about that before that have been squashed by myself as chair, and I do strongly encourage trustees to keep things equitable and discuss things in with equity in mind, and not to single out schools, nor to assume or imply that that administration does that either. Trustee Burgess, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm going to keep the camera off just because of how things are going. I'm not supporting the motion as it stands, and I'd like to give a little bit of rationale behind that, so that if things come forward again, even in a report or whatever, that I can be understood anyway. Number one, the motion, contrary to what a previous speaker said, motions really should be somewhat general in nature and not specific. We have been trending towards these really descriptive, really pointed, really involved motions. And that doesn't give the leeway that administration and those who implement them need to have, and defer to that expert implementation and understanding. I too take great exception to any reference to discriminatory practices of built environment based on immigration standards. I would like a comment from administration that where immigration standards sit in the realm of infrastructure improvements. I want it from admin definitively. I know that in some of the schools that were mentioned in the budget update and in the description, I will say that Kingsville Public School is not a very visibly or diverse school. Jack Minor isn't. Kingsville District High School isn't. And yet they could certainly, they would love to have, you know, increased ventilation. But because they are not eligible for this funding, because they are scheduled to close within 5 years, they won't be getting it. But my point would be, I really don't want any aspersions to any kind of criteria that we judge infrastructure improvements to comfort of teaching and learning conditions with who's in the building. The other thing that I find very problematic is a fundraising plan, etc. When we have fundraising, it's generally outside of school budgets. It's a revenue source that is extra. And then we deal with real equity issues, have and have not. The ability for any individual schools, any family of schools, any whatever, to fundraise for some sort of capital improvement that may not be able to be raised in the same way, where somebody might, some other school, some other family school might actually be in higher need, but they don't have the ability to fundraise. That's a real equity problem for me. This motion is beyond amendment. That could be within substitution. I wouldn't mind saying have an annual ventilation report. I'm okay with that. But the way that it stands, having an ad hoc committee, etc., in fundraising, the committee membership, etc., I can't support it the way it is. And Madam Chair, if I could, references to how we govern and what expertise we bring to the table, etc. I think that every motion in front of us is usually out of our realm of personally implementing it. However, we do have to govern and oversee. So sometimes things come in our path where we have to take on extra professional development. And I'd just like to say, back in the early 2000s, we had a quite serious grievance come forward to us that was picked up provincially, etc. It's over with now, and I think you could speak about it. But it was very public. And it was at Ruthven Public School because of the indoor air quality. There were teaching and learning conditions. Mr. Laframboise referred to some of them because of the nature of the ventilation in the building that had no mechanical ventilation. It was under scrutiny for closure, and it would have been $500,000 to put a mechanical system on that building in order to offer.
I don't want to interrupt, but we do have a bit of a limit here on time, so I'd like you to, if we can wrap it up.
Well, because I was representing that area, the school was scheduled for closure. It was a ventilation issue. I did attend the Indoor Air Quality Tools for Schools full course offered by the Environmental Protection Agency, and to understand some of these issues. And the aging infrastructure that was relayed to earlier, this motion before us doesn't really look at the fullness of the issue before us. And that's just a ventilation report annually. So I'm not supporting it the way it is. And I feel very comfortable in making the assessment and listening to the experts going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Trustee Sheen, before I get to your comment, does anyone have a first question? Trustee Halberstadt, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask administration to comment briefly on the merit of the motion. I seconded Trustee Shin's motion to give her an opportunity to discuss. My initial reaction is that it's we've gone over a lot of this stuff before, and how much further do we need to go without slowing the process down, actually?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I'll start the answer, and then certainly I would look to Ms. Hinchliffe and to Mr. Laframboise. We've had conversations about this, particularly when we revised the air conditioning policy and regulation, where we specifically indicated in that policy and regulation that when we were building new schools, that we would be implementing air conditioning in those schools. We have 5-6 new schools that are opening just in the next 2 years. All those schools will have air conditioning, and that also leads to the schools that are being replaced. They're older schools, and certainly when those schools shut down and we open our new schools, we're going to have much more spaces in our facilities that are air conditioned. Certainly, I know that there was a report that went forward to trustees back in 2019. The cost to put air conditioning in these spaces at that time was over $100 million. And we saw what happened last week with North Shore when we were having a conversation about the design and budget and just the change in 30 days on air handling units alone. So, I mean, the $100 million is probably much greater than that. So cost certainly is a factor, and it's not the only factor, but we do have to be realistic to think about that. There are building envelope issues that Mr. Laframboise has mentioned, and perhaps, you know, Mr. Laframboise and Ms. Hinchliffe, you might be able to answer or add a little bit further to Trustee Halberstadt's questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Armstrong, sorry. Through you, Madam Chair. One of the things that was mentioned, I believe, in the 2019 report was the percentage of school square footage that is air conditioned. And in 2019, it was over, I think it was 64 or 65%. So we are slowly, as Superintendent Armstrong indicated, we are slowly moving forward with the new schools that open. It's going to be over 70%. We at Facility Services continue to look at opportunities to make the learning environment more comfortable for children. Absolutely. And we will always strive to do that. And we will always look at ways to make that work. And even as we improve conditions or replace equipment, we look for opportunities to make those adjustments. So I'll let Mr. Laframboise put anything he can add on to that.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I think they said it quite well. We do look for every opportunity. My one thing that I would add is that every comfort challenge that we face is unique. And there are a number of things that contribute to user comfort, the built environment, of course, being a big one. So there are many times where you know, it's actually like a wall surface and how close people sit, or you know, the air currents inside of a room. So there are a number of things when we go to look at user comfort challenges into improving that user comfort. I know it's, you know, even for me, it's easy to say, well, you know, cooling. There are a huge number of factors that play into that concept of improving user comfort, and that's really at the forefront of almost every decision that we make when it comes to mechanical systems. There are also components, window components, and some other components as well that it's always top of mind for me and for all of us as we work through all of the other components of a building. So it's always there, and we're always working towards it.
Thank you very much. Is there any follow-up, Trustee Halberstadt?
No, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Chin, I'll allow you a comment, although I will reiterate again that if there are any discussions of a particular school, I will cut you off of your comment. So I will allow you to make your last comment, and then I will make comment, and then we will call the question. Go ahead, Trustee Chin.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate all these opinions and suggestions. And I have to say first that my English is not good enough to make a very perfect explanation. And in my motion I didn't mention this particular school, but I just as an example I give it. If you don't think it's okay, you can just ignore it. But I do think that air conditioning issue is an important issue. It even affect the enrollment of the board. Because I heard a parent from another school and said that it's not in my area, but from other school, and said it's too hot in the school, so they have to transfer to the Catholic board because they have air conditioning. So I want to mention that it's kind of affect a lot. It's not only a discomfort issue, and also this motion is open to any amendment or change. My purpose is just to try to make clear this issue and try to find some way to improve and protect the students. And it's not that against anybody. I just try to improve because the issue is urgent, I think, because the summer is coming. And also that I appreciate, I respect the expert here, but I think if we have a committee, if we involve more experts to debate and involve the parents to ask questions, that will make the issue clearer. And if the senior administration is correct, then it can help to clarify, to relieve the complaints, the uncomfort feeling of the parents and the students. So I think from whatever reasons, I think it's good to have a committee to try to handle this issue. And as for if it is ad hoc or it is a longer term, and I'm okay, because my purpose is just to try to find the issue and improve. And the parents and the students are obviously not satisfied with the performance of the air conditioning upgrade or improvement. And this has been so many years. I talked with a person graduated from Massey, and sorry, I don't say, yeah, okay. from our board, and he was so strange. He said after so many years still no air conditioning. So I just don't want to after 5 or 10 years we still have this excuse. And it cannot, answer the, suspect and questions from the parents. I want to provide a panel or a place for better communication and to involve more experts. If you think I involve more people, not experts, it's okay. Yeah.
Wrap up your comments.
Yeah. So my purpose is just to raise this issue and try to find some way to solve it. And as for the format or the people involving that is open to change. I hope trustees, if you think anything is inappropriate, you just change it. And as for, I apologize for the previous, I said,
I'm gonna have
I want to clarify something, just one sentence. As for the equity and discrimination, I just transfer the parents' complaint here, and I think we need to clarify this issue.
I'm gonna stop it right there.
Okay.
Stop it right there.
Okay, thank you. I'm okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So I'm going to make just my last quick comment here, and I do appreciate Trustee Cheen what you've attempted to do here and attempted to address something that we have been talking about for quite a while, talking about before this group of trustees got here. Certainly on policy committee, we've talked about it for years, and we've talked about it in a report from 2019. This is an ongoing issue. I don't think it's solved by an ad hoc committee. I don't think it's solved by the mechanisms that are put in place here. And as for the suggestion that the motion can be amended, to me, it's too problematic to even start with an amendment. And it is far too problematic for me to support at this time. I think we do have policy-based decisions. We have a policy in place right now. We do have communication with senior administration, and we and through them we can communicate with some of the experts that we've been grateful to hear from tonight with regards to what has been happening and what can continue to happen. What's within the realm of possibility under the governance framework that we and oversight that we have as trustees. And so for those reasons, I will not be supporting it this evening. So I will call the question on E5. All those opposed, please put so in the chat. All those opposed, please put it in the chat. I have opposition from Trustee Cook, opposition from Trustee Burgess, Trustee Leclerc, Trustee Sartori, Trustee Olmsted, and myself. That motion fails this evening. Thank you very much, trustees. Moving on to F1 in our agenda, report of the Director of Education. She got a week's extension on her due date.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And if I fade out here a bit, I've been having real trouble staying on the internet tonight. Anyway, I'm looking for my assistant, Rochelle, there. I'm sure she's going to bring something up.
No, it's actually me, and I'm trying here.
Okay. It seems more difficult with the internet tonight than it's ever been.
I somehow feel like I started this tonight. Dropping in, dropping out.
It's just taking my computer a minute to think here.
No worries.
It's frozen. Try one more time.
If it doesn't work, I could read parts of it or certainly post it for people and send it along. Perhaps that's what I could do.
Yeah, it keeps freezing on me. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, there's some wonderful images of some things happening around the photography contest and where a kindergarten student has an image. And so some of those things I think would be nice to share, and the awards for Strive and the Exceptional Children Conference. And so I will post that. I'm sorry that it didn't come up tonight, but I just want to say that it's been an amazing year. We've learned a lot, especially about ourselves. And I just want to wish everyone a wonderful, relaxing summer. And I look forward to having everyone back at school in September. Thank you. And thank you for the Board of Trustees for their support this year.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So we will get, or Madam Director, we will get a copy of that sent to us, hopefully. So sorry we couldn't see that for us tonight. Looks like we have a question from Trustee Burgess.
Yes, in the absence of seeing the report, it might have been covered, but do you anticipate us convening over the summer to have another special meeting of the board? Today, I made a complete mistake. I saw the Microsoft Teams meeting and it said budget meeting, and I thought, well, okay, that's just the budget meeting. I couldn't find the regular board meeting, Microsoft Teams thing, and understanding that this agenda has no opportunity for trustee question period and or my notice of motion that I was hoping to bring forward. So is there an opportunity over the summer? I know July administration will be hopefully recharging all those batteries and taking such an overdue rest. You've had no time. I want to applaud senior admin, but will we have an opportunity before school opening to revisit some of the things where there are some uncertainties now?
This isn't trustee question period, but what I can answer for you, if there's a need and there may be new directors.
Madam, sir, just to be clear, I thought you would have maybe covered it in your memo as a wrap up of what's coming forward. So I thought if you had mentioned it, I don't know if it was there. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. No, if there are issues, and again, there may be changes, especially with health protocols in the summer. And I noticed the minister has announced that there will be announcements at the end of July. We would certainly work with the chair to see if there was a need for meetings, and we will do our very best to keep you updated. Thank you, Trustee Burgess, for the comment.
Thank you very much. All right. Do we have a report from our OPSPA director or delegate this evening?
Yes, Madam Chair, I do.
Go ahead, Trustee Burgess.
I have submitted some confidential labor relations updates. Certainly look at those. And for trustees, they are necessarily discussed in private session, but we didn't have one today, but they are for your perusal.
Is now joining.
And there have been, I just wanted to say that staff members at OPSPA have really aided us in our governance role immensely this year. You'll see the updates from Jennifer McIntyre about legislative updates. And of course, the legislature has now concluded their current session as of June the 14th. TJ Gertz continues to provide daily media updates as well to keep us current, and look for those even over the summer. There will be updates for media, and I think there will be education, and return to school will be still hot news throughout the summer. On June 11th, I attended the OPSPA Board of Directors meeting, and the OPSPA summary has also been distributed and will be attached to the minutes. That's also publicly available should anybody want to access that on www.opspa.org. Additionally, many thanks to Trustee Hickison, who is the GECDSB voting delegate and who voted on all the resolutions and elections on behalf of our board. After the AGM, additionally, I attended the OPSPA virtual AGM on June the 12th, as well as the Western Region meeting and elections, and subsequently the OPSPA organizational meeting. Our new Western chair is Arlene Morell from Thames Valley, and the Western vice chair is Jan Johnstone from Blue Water. GECDSB's Alicia Hickison was elected as alternative member to the Provincial Education Program Work Team, and I was re-elected to the Provincial Policy Development Work Team. These have really met a lot more frequently in this last year, and I anticipate that this next year will be somewhat similar. Perhaps maybe we can get out of only virtually meeting, but I know that there's going to be close to, there was, I think, a dozen meetings or something. So thanks for that dedication to put your name forward, Trustee Hickison. A recent expression of one of the pieces of work that we've had for several years has been reflected in the provincial government's new commitment to French language supports in hiring, training, recruitment, and retention of school board personnel who have qualifications in French language. Seeing an urgent need, OPSPA took this on as an initiative within the education program work team for a few years now, and it's really paid off with some government action and a 4-year action plan coming from them. And I've included in my report links to those documents. And before we break for the summer, I'd really strongly encourage all members of our board, both elected and administration, as well as all of our employee groups, our parent guardians, all affected committees such as SEAC, GECDSB, Anti-Black Racism, everyone individually or collectively, if you want to get together and form something, to consider submitting their thoughts on the OPSPA discussion paper. The discussion paper is titled Transitioning from the COVID-19 School Experience, and it also can be found on the OPSPA website. This is a really, really important paper that we really need great input to. This is a process of reflection, and it's revealed two compelling realities: that a worrisome number of students have been unable to profit from remote forms of learning, and that several innovative practices in pedagogy and leadership have emerged that should be preserved and implemented on a broader scale post-pandemic. So please go to that www.opspa.org, access that discussion paper, or please contact Judith Nyman. And everybody's address at OPSPA is their first initial and last name at opspa.org. So for Judith, JNYMAN at opspa.org. And envision what education, public education, can look like in the future in a post-pandemic world. And that ends my report.
Thank you very much, Trustee Burgess, and congratulations to you on your re-election to Policy Committee on our behalf. I know that's quite a bit of work, and we thank you very much for your contributions, continued contributions there. Thank you. Any questions for our OPSPA Director this evening? Seeing none, thank you very much, Trustee Burgess. And yes, please take advantage of all the ways that we can contribute all the way up the chain. We just discussed sending a letter this evening to the ministry, and this is yet another way that that we can have our voices be heard at the ministry level. Moving on to F3, our community planning and partnerships report on potential spaces available. Do we have a presentation? Superintendent Armstrong, I'm seeing you. Go ahead.
Thank you, through Madam Chair. It's not really a presentation. I just wanted to introduce the report. This is an annual update that is provided to trustees with information regarding the potential use of unused spaces that are available for community partnerships on a cost recovery basis in our schools. And we had a public meeting on December the 3rd, 2020, that was hosted by Superintendent Allwender and myself. The current pandemic certainly has created a number of challenges this year with the temporary curtailment of the use of our school sites for our community partners, and of course with our students and our teachers for in-person learning. The board continues to follow all public health guidance with respect to use of our spaces. Appendix 1 of the report outlines the individuals who were invited to the meeting. It was also posted on the board's website so that we were able to share that information across the community. As I indicated, our meeting was on December the 3rd. The groups that are highlighted in the bold font on Appendix 1 were the groups that participated in the meeting. Appendix 2 provides a summary of the unused spaces that are available for partnership in our schools. And Appendix 3 provides a summary of the facility partnerships that currently exist with the board. And with that, myself and Superintendent Allwender would be happy to take any questions.
Trustees, do we have any questions for Superintendent Armstrong or Superintendent Allwender? Go ahead, Trustee Sipkaris.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair, I just wanted to ask, one of the things that we heard from a delegate at last week's meeting was that they weren't part of one of the groups that was consulted. And I was just wondering how often that list of community partners gets updated, and how do we decide who gets to be on that list?
Thank you for that question, through you, Madam Chair. We review the list annually as we prepare for the meeting. Certainly, while direct invitations go out to the groups that were listed in Appendix A, the meeting is open to all community groups, which is why we advertise it on the board's website. It's certainly no intention to exclude any groups, and we're certainly always open and willing to include additional groups on that list with a direct invitation. We'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. And so as a supplemental, if we had a suggestion of a group that expressed interest, that it would be completely acceptable to request that they be invited then.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can contact myself or my administration assistant, Tammy Malash.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions on this report this evening? Go ahead, Trustee Burgess.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, if I could, I note, of course, that Kingsville District High School is one of the schools on page 157 that's listed that is not, is excluded from the list because of funding for replacement schools, etc. But of course, part of KDHS is Migration Hall. And not only is there a community use that has been severely compromised, Migration Community Hall, was also funded in capital from community partnership initially, and its committee has representation from the town of Kingsville and other partners, community partners. So as far as Migration Hall goes, is there anything that I can tell them in our Migration Hall committee meeting tomorrow that is an update as far as any community planning and partnerships coming forward for Migration Hall, since it is that kind of netherland of community partner and school board property that is excluded, but still used as community?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I'm not aware of any requests for use of Migration Hall beyond the group that's already currently using it. So certainly if there are any requests for use of that space, we would certainly encourage that information to come forward. We continue to follow the province's reopening guidelines. And so with phase 1, and as we have throughout the last school year, it's made it difficult, impossible, quite frankly, to use that space based on the province's guidelines and the health protocols. But we're hopeful with the moving into stage 2 that we may be able to relax some of those restrictions, and we're always happy to work with the community, with all our community partners with respect to that.
Well, supplemental, since we're not meeting over the summer except for, an extraordinary opportunity to, if stage 2 happens, how would we be notified of that?
Yes, through you, Madam Chair, through our rental office, and that would be through Ms. Hinchliff's department. Certainly the rental department keeps in contact with our rental groups with respect to when our facilities are going to be available for use. And so certainly that communication does occur, and we would be posting information on the board's website as well as another tool, and through social media when those spaces become available.
So if I could just put a fine point on it, when stage 2 comes about, chances are that Domino will make those announcements come forward through social media and through facility services if we contact them.
Certainly, yes, through you, Madam Chair. Yes, our rental department will work with our typical groups that have requested the space or that we would expect would want the space, and we'll be reaching out to them. And we currently are in conversations with other groups that are inquiring with that information. And we will certainly be reaching out and communicating with them as soon as our health protocols relax.
Thank you.
Excellent news. Thank you very much. Any other questions on this report this evening from trustees? Seeing and hearing none, thank you very much. We'll move on to F4, BCV-S, examination of recommendations from Hamilton Wentworth District School Board panel report. Do I have a member of administration who's looking to table this report, or am I just taking questions?
It's Director Kelly, and I believe if there were any questions, the report it was for information, but if there are any questions, I think Superintendent Pike is on the phone to answer any questions you may have.
Wonderful. Do I have any questions from trustees? Trustee Sipcar, go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure if this is for Superintendent Pike or if it's just, I'm not entirely sure if she was the chair of the committee. My question was simply, I read the report and I noticed that there were 10 recommendations made by the Hamilton Wentworth Board, and for some reason we only chose 3 of those. And from the report, it just seems that everybody voted on their top 3, and those were the ones that we decided to go with. But I kind of would have liked to see all 10 recommendations, or understanding why our board would not consider other ones, rather than just a voting in terms of popularity of which ones were deemed most important. I guess my question is why only 3? And were there other recommendations on the list that had merit in terms of being considered? And then further to that point, the specific motion asked for the creation of an independent student ombudsman position, and that wasn't a motion that made it on there. So I'm just curious how we got to narrowing it down to 3 without any really rhyme or reason.
Hi, it's Sharon on the phone. So thank you for the question. It's to do with the Hamilton Wentworth report. It does have 10 recommendations, but within that, under each one, there are many action steps. So for a board to take a look at all 10 and implement all 10 would be a monumental task. There's no doubt, with all of the different recommended action steps that are underneath it. So when we took a look and we went through each one of the recommendations and each one of the recommended action steps in one of our committee meetings, and then we went with voting on what were the ones that they could see as committee members that were dovetailing over. So there were some recommendations or action steps under one recommendation, let's say, that there were some the same and other ones. So we took to see which big ideas did we really want to make an impact for the board based on this particular report. So we did do our top 3, and within that, it really aligned nicely with what most of the people that were on the committee had chosen as their first, second, or third recommendation. So when we take a look at the report, it does speak to the top 3, and then as you can see underneath it, those action steps are the ones that were summarized from the Hamilton Wentworth report. And then we went with, for the bullying prevention and intervention plan, it would be for 2 years. But no, Trustee Sipcar, that it did touch upon the other ones as well within the 10 recommendations that were put into the Hamilton Wentworth report. When you talk about the 2 that are specifically named in the motion, those 2, as we went through and took a look at what we really wanted to move forward with as a group, those did not come forward as ones that had many people looking to it to have it part of the plan. So that was the process that we took in order to take a look at these lots of wonderful, wonderful things that overall we can see our board looking at, analyzing, and seeing what we can put forward in the board. But at this point, these are the ones that we focused on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Cheen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a trustee in this subcommittee, and I have to say that it's not it is not satisfied and report, and this committee, the whole procedure has a problem, and it has, you know, big cap of each individual items. It belongs to each category. It's not, you know, it's not consulted with the committee members, and it's not alignment with correctly, and it's difficult to answer the survey. And also, obviously, student, for example, student center is the most important. Nobody say no. Parent involvement is important, but the items not belongs to this caps, belongs to these categories is moved out, leaved out. I wonder if you can understand. The whole procedure has a lot of problem. So I already, you know, mentioned this, discussed during the committee, and it's not taken at all. So I as the main, you know, main mover of the motion twice, and I make another motion to delay this accepting this report. Thank you.
Was that a motion to delay the, there is no motion to accept the report. We just accept the report this evening. So there is no.
Point of order, Madam Chair?
Yes.
By merely having it in our hands, we receive it. But I think if there is a motion that wants to be brought forward from the report, that's in order. We physically have received, but if there's a recommendation to do something with it, like keep the committee going or get a subsequent report.
Indeed, yes,
or
but that, yes, indeed, that is in order, but that was not what was requested.
So, Madam Chair, to point of order, that's what I heard.
What was asked was whether we would not receive the report. And I'm fit to be clarified on that. Trustee Cheen, was that the request that we not receive the report this evening?
I just don't accept the report and the suggestions. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Cook, go ahead.
So I was also on that committee, and I have to 150,000% disagree with Trustee Chin. This committee followed the motion. We had teachers on there, we had principals on there, we had obviously Superintendent Pike, and myself, Trustee Halberstadt, and Trustee Chin. The reason why we didn't take all 10 is because it's an unbelievable task to do that, and some of which is in that report we already do. So we very fairly chose the top 3 after much discussion, and even more discussion after everyone got a chance to vote on it, to vote what they thought was important. There was a reason why these were chosen, and it was a very fair committee, a very interesting committee. Learned a lot just from talking to administration. When I say administration, I'm talking about the principals, and listening to some of their struggles that they have and what they thought was important too. Everyone had a fair chance. Trustee Chin did not vote. Everybody else, to my knowledge, did. So moving forward, you know, this report is an excellent report, and it's a great way to start and make some changes and get some involvement from parents to help us at each school with struggles that we have with bullying. So moving forward, I want to thank Superintendent Pike for all the work that she put into this committee, as well as the last bullying committee that we had. And I think it's fine, and it's a good report, and it's a very good way to start.
Thank you very much. Trustee Cheney won't be taking a second comment on this from anyone, but Trustee Halberstadt, go ahead with your first question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I was on the committee too, and I kind of side with Trustee Shin on a couple of things. I think the committee, and there was great people on it for sure, as Trustee Cook suggested, but it was a bit top heavy with regard to administration compared to the trustees. There were 3 trustees, so obviously Trustee Cook had a different opinion than maybe the other 2 trustees. But what bothered me a little bit was that the Hamilton recommendations really are premature. I've talked to the people in Hamilton, including the chair of the board, Don Dunby, and also the office of the director, and they're just getting started with what they're going to be doing, including the recommendation for an ombudsman person representing the student, a student ombudsman person, and also an independent table, and which suggests best practices that the board might adopt in its anti-bullying plan. Those 2 were discarded by our committee. They did a survey monkey, and those are the ones that came up that are up before us tonight. So, secondly, what I have a bit of a problem with is the original motion. It was called Bullying, Cyberbullying, and Violent Incident Causing Injury to Students, BCVS. And basically, I asked several times if I could get a copy of the injury report that the province does every year, and administration denied that. So I'm going to make a notice of motion that asking administration to allow the trustees to see the report from the Ministry of Education, which is basically tabulates violent incidences in all the school boards in the province. And our trustees have not had virtue of that, the privilege of seeing that, as well as the other members of the ad hoc committee. So for that reason, I'm going to oppose this. It isn't a motion, I guess. I've spoken to it, but I guess you know how I feel, and it would be good if it was deferred to after the Hamilton people have a deeper dive study into their recommendations, which is about five months old now, but they are just starting out. It'd be good to see what they come up with by the end of the summer, when they're going to be dealing with it on a much more in-depth fashion.
Thank you, Trustee Halberstadt. I'll take Trustee Burgess. Trustee Cook, I'm not taking second questions or comments on these reports this evening, unfortunately. Trustee Burgess, you can go ahead with your first comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I wasn't on the committee, and I've tried to follow it through folks who have been on the committee. What I'm hearing is a disappointment in, I don't know, I think student voice maybe, or whatever. I think we're all capable of being bullies. I think trustees can be, administration can be, I think students certainly can be, parents can be. We're all capable of it. And as far as physical violence, I didn't see anything in this report that alludes to fulfilling that. So my question is this report shows a focus of for the next couple of years. Is this report mean the work of the ad hoc committee considers itself fulfilled, that it has met the letter and intent of the motion, or will this committee continue to convene? Because what I'm hearing from two trustee members anyway, is that they would like, I think, some more discussion perhaps. And I just want to make sure that, is this a conclusion of this committee in the committee's eyes, whoever the chair was, or can we expect it to continue?
Madam Chair, may I answer that, Eve? I wasn't the chair.
No.
Okay.
No, unfortunately, it has to go through administration to this report. These reports are not asking questions of each trustee. Senior administration, Superintendent Pike.
Yes, I can answer that question. This is a motion number 2. That's what we call it. And it's to do with the acronym that Trustee Halberstadt talked about. And that was based on the very first motion. So according to the ad hoc committee and the purpose of the motion, this committee, ad hoc committee, has met its mandate.
Thank you. Any supplemental, Trustee Burgess?
No, I don't think so. I think if anything was further or outstanding, somebody could make another motion to that effect, when we have an opportunity to make a notice of motion, I guess, next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other trustees have first questions on this?
Do we have?
We don't have anything on the agenda tonight for a notice of motion, because this agenda, keep in mind, is part of a motion that we made on the last agenda, and it just is dealing with the motions and the agenda items that we moved off of that. So this is just a continuation of that meeting where we've already had a notice of motion. So we won't have another one until we have another meeting.
Okay, at that point, I'll bring a notice of motion to provide the information on the violated instances.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much for that, trustees. We're at one of the last items on our agenda, the chair's report for me this evening. I continue to have phone meetings with
is now exiting.
Minister Lecce some Mondays, and it looks as if we will be continuing those meetings into the summer. I don't know how frequently, but I will keep you updated on what I keep trustees updated on what we hear from those meetings as we move forward throughout the summer. I'm sure there will be plenty of changes as we are used to now. I want to give my sincerest thank yous to all staff and administrators for your excellence under yet another year of uncertainty. Educators, administrators, and support staff who've continued to offer in-person learning to our Steps and Gains students, who've upheld our very first Greater Essex County virtual school, and those who've transitioned our elementary and secondary students from person to remote online delivery and then back again. It's in your connections to students that keep our family of Greater Essex really thriving. And so I hope you enjoy your summer break with your version of family. I want to thank you to our senior team and Director Kelly for the leadership you've demonstrated, for the countless quick switches you've had to make, and for keeping the safety and staff of students and communities at the forefront of all our difficult choices this year. To all of you in our Greater Essex County community, I am humbled and extremely GECDSB proud of how we've managed this very difficult year. This goes to my colleagues as well around the trustee table. I know it's not been near easy. I know at times it's been probably hard beyond words, and thank you doesn't seem like enough, but I sincerely and deeply thank you. To our graduates and families, congratulations on your achievements, not only this challenging grad year, but all the ones before it that led to this success. I have a graduate of my own this year. She graduates grade 8 in 2 short days, which seems like a lifetime and a blink of an eye all at once. We're proud of each of our graduates. We're grateful to your support systems, and we wish you all the best in wherever your path to greatness happens to take you. I do hope that each and every one of you, all of you, are able to enjoy a safe break. You've all more than earned it. All of you, you've all more than earned it. We need to fill our own cups so that we have the ability to help others, and help others we will. as we have and as we will continue to do. Enjoy the sunshine, stay safe, and we will be so thrilled to see you all again. That includes our very newest learners back in the fall. And with that, we will adjourn this evening. Thank you so much, everyone.